A warship rests under a skyscraper in New York City. A pharaoh's sacred vessel lies buried in the sands of Egypt, 1,000 miles from any coast. These are not isolated mistakes, but clues to a hidden pattern across time. You are about to explore 50 historical ships found impossibly far from any ocean. By the end, you will understand how these stranded giants rewrite everything we know about ancient trade, climate change, and human belief. How did a Viking longship end up in an Estonian field? And what doomed a king's flagship before it even reached the open sea? Each discovery is a puzzle piece in a global mystery. What does it truly mean for a civilization to be lost? The story of ships far from the sea begins not with a wreck, but with a perfect, intentional burial. At the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza, sealed for 45 centuries in an airtight limestone tomb, rests the Khufu ship. Discovered in 1954, this vessel is a marvel of preservation. Its cedar planks still lashed together with ropes, a ghost of a ship waiting in the dark. It stretches over 140 feet long, a testament to the advanced shipbuilding of Egypt's Old Kingdom. But here is the first great mystery of our list. This magnificent boat was never designed to touch water. It was built for a journey of pure spirit. This was a solar bark, a sacred vessel constructed for the pharaoh Khufu himself. Ancient Egyptians believed the sun god Ra sailed across the sky by day and through the underworld by night. In death, the pharaoh, a god on earth, would join that eternal voyage. The Khufu ship was his celestial chariot, buried at the pyramid's foot to carry his soul across the heavens for eternity. So it sits, a seafaring masterpiece, in the heart of the desert, 1,000 miles from the nearest open ocean. It rewrites our very definition of a ship's purpose, proving that the most important voyages a civilization can imagine might have nothing to do with water at all, and everything to do with faith. But if the Khufu ship was a vessel of faith, the next discovery is one of pure, brutal ambition. On a quiet coastal meadow in Estonia, on the island of Saaremaa, the earth held a secret for over 1,200 years. Here, far from the familiar fjords of Norway or Denmark, archaeologists unearthed 2 Viking ships. They are clinker-built, their overlapping planks a signature of Norse craftsmanship, but they are not resting in a Scandinavian harbor. They are buried in the Estonian soil, and they are not alone. Inside are the skeletons of more than 40 warriors, laid to rest with their swords, spearheads, and even their gaming pieces. This is not a ceremonial ship burial for a chieftain. This is a war grave, a single, catastrophic event frozen in time. These men died in the late 8th century, a full generation before the famous Viking raid on Lindisfarne in England, which history books often mark as the start of the Viking Age. That date is now obsolete. The Salmi ships force a dramatic rewrite. They prove that organized, deadly Viking expeditions were pushing eastward into the Baltic Sea, hundreds of miles from home, much earlier than anyone believed. These warriors sailed for weeks, navigating unknown coasts for what? Trade, perhaps, or more likely a raid that went terribly wrong. Their ship, their most vital possession, became their tomb. It shows the core Viking truth that their world was defined by the reach of their longships. In life, these vessels carried them to fortune and fame. In death, even on a distant foreign shore, the ship remained the essential vessel, the only fitting coffin for men who lived and died by the sea's horizon. Their final voyage ended not on water, but in the quiet mud of an Estonian meadow, a stark message sent across the centuries that the age of the Viking had begun not with a whisper, but with a buried battle cry. Yet the Viking ambition to reach distant shores was not a new human impulse. Centuries before the first Norse keel touched the Baltic, another civilization was mastering the art of the impossible voyage, not for raiding but for riches. The evidence rests not in a meadow but on a steep, rocky slope in southern Turkey, over 150 feet beneath the surface of the Mediterranean Sea. This is the Ulubyoran shipwreck, a time capsule from the late Bronze Age, around 1300 years before the Common Era. Its location is a dramatic cliff face near the town of Kash, but its story is one of staggering distance. This was not a local fishing boat. When it sank, it was carrying the equivalent of a royal treasury. Its hull was packed with 10 tons of raw copper ingots from Cyprus, alongside precious tin from much farther afield. It held ebony logs from Egypt, cobalt blue glass from Mesopotamia, and even amber beads that originated in the distant Baltic forests over 2,000 miles away. Think about that for a moment. In an age without maps, without compasses, a single wooden ship connected the mines of Cyprus, the workshops of Canaan, the palaces of Egypt, and the northern amber trails. Every item in its hold was a link in a vast, interlocking chain of commerce and diplomacy that stretched across the known world. The Ulubyoran was a floating marketplace, a diplomatic courier, and a testament to a globalized economy that thrived over 3,000 years ago. Its tragic end on that Turkish coast froze a moment of incredible connectivity. Today, raised from the deep and displayed in a museum, its reassembled timbers and replicated cargo sit high above the very shoreline it failed to reach. It is a permanent monument to a network so sophisticated, so far-reaching, that its collapse would plunge the Mediterranean into a dark age. So we must ask, what kind of world required such a ship, and what catastrophe could make such a vital link simply vanish from the sea? The collapse of the Bronze Age network revealed a terrifying truth, that even the most advanced trade routes are fragile. But from that darkness, a new and even more resilient system would rise, one built not for kings but for merchants. Its symbol was not a treasure-laden galley, but a humble, sturdy cargo ship, and one of the most perfect examples of this new era was found not in the open sea, but buried in the mud of a quiet riverbank. In 1962, construction workers in the German city of Bremen were digging foundations along the river Weser when their shovels struck ancient blackened timber. They had uncovered the Bremen cog, a merchant ship from the 14th century, so perfectly preserved it seemed to have been placed there yesterday. This was the workhorse of its age, a single-masted, round-hulled vessel built for capacity and endurance over speed. For centuries, ships like this one were the backbone of the Hanseatic League, a powerful alliance of trading cities that dominated commerce across the Baltic and North Seas. But here is the crucial detail: the Bremen cog was not found in a harbor or a coastal wreck site. It was discovered over 30 miles inland, buried in the silt of a river. This changes everything. It proves these ships were not just coastal huggers. They were designed to sail upriver, penetrating deep into the heart of continental Europe. Cities like Bremen, Hamburg, and Lübeck grew powerful precisely because they were nodes where sea routes met river systems. A cog like this could load timber and grain from the German interior, sail down the Weser to the North Sea, travel to London or Bergen, and return with wool, salt, or dried fish. Its very structure tells the story. The flat bottom allowed it to settle safely on a riverbed at low tide for loading, while its high sides could handle the punishing waves of the open sea. The Bremen cog is a time capsule of medieval life. Its hold contained the mundane essentials of a long voyage: wooden plates, barrels, even a pair of leather shoes. But it also held secrets, like a small, carved wooden figure, perhaps a sailor's good luck charm. This ship makes the Hanseatic League tangible. It was not an abstract political entity, but a physical network of wood, rope, and sail, operated by merchants and crews whose entire world was defined by the cargo their vessel could carry. The cog's discovery so far from the ocean reminds us that the mightiest commercial empires are not built on battlefields, but on reliable, repetitive journeys connecting the quiet riverbank to the vast open sea. The humble cog built empires on reliability, but the next vessel in our story was a declaration of power meant to awe the world. On a calm August day in 1628, the mighty warship Vasa sailed from the Stockholm shipyard on her maiden voyage. Crowds line the shores to watch the pride of the Swedish Navy, a floating fortress adorned with 700 intricate sculptures and armed with 64 bronze cannons. She was a symbol of King Gustavus Adolphus's ambition, designed to dominate the Baltic. Yet, less than a mile from her dock, a gentle gust of wind filled her sails. The Vasa heeled over, water rushed through her open gun ports, and she sank swiftly into the cold, brackish harbor. The catastrophe unfolded in full view of the city, a stunning and very public failure. For over 300 years, she lay preserved in the dark, oxygen-poor mud, a perfect time capsule. When she was raised in 1961, it was as if the 17th century had been pulled back into the light. Her ornate carvings of lions, emperors, and mermaids still held their original paint. The bones of crew members were found beside their possessions, pewter plates, leather shoes, and even a backgammon set, a poignant snapshot of lives interrupted. The Vasa's tragedy was not one of storm or battle, but of fatal ambition. She was top-heavy, her hull too narrow for the towering masts and heavy gun decks demanded by the king. She was a ship built for intimidation, not stability, and she never even reached the open sea. Today, she sits in her own museum in Stockholm, a monument not to naval glory, but to the perilous gap between human ambition and the unforgiving laws of physics. She is a ship that found its final resting place almost within sight of where it was built, a permanent reminder that the most dangerous voyage is sometimes the shortest one. The Vasa's failure was a spectacle of human error, but the next ships on our list speak of an error on a planetary scale, one written not in wood but in stone. Deep within the blistering heart of the Sahara Desert, on the sun-bleached cliffs of the Tassili Enadja Range in Algeria and the remote Gilf Kebir Plateau in Egypt, ancient artists left a message that seems impossible. They painted detailed, graceful images of boats, not isolated symbols but clear depictions of reed vessels with crews paddling through waters teeming with fish, surrounded by hippos and giraffes. The most famous of these is the Cave of the Swimmers in Egypt, where figures are shown in mid-stroke, gliding through a blue world that has not existed for millennia. This is not a record of ships lost in the desert. It is a memory of a time when the Sahara was not a desert at all. Between roughly 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, this region was a green savanna, a mosaic of grasslands, lakes, and flowing rivers. The people who lived there were not stranded sailors. They were fishermen and hunters who used lightweight reed boats to navigate their lush, watery world. Their art is a nautical map of a lost landscape. Then, slowly, the climate shifted. The rains failed, the lakes dried up, and the sands advanced. The rivers that once carried those simple boats vanished, leaving only their stone silhouettes as a testament. These paintings force us to confront a staggering reality. The greatest ocean these ships ever sailed was not made of salt water, but of time itself. They sailed across an epoch, and when that age ended, their legacy was left high and dry, a ghost fleet immortalized on canyon walls, forever sailing in a sea of rock and memory. The ghost fleet painted on Saharan rock shows a world transformed by climate, but sometimes a ship is buried not by shifting sands, but by the simple passage of time and mud. In the summer of 2002, in the heart of the Welsh city of Newport, construction crews began digging foundations for a new riverside arts center. Their machinery scraped against something massive and stubborn just a few meters below the modern streets. Archaeologists were called in, and they soon realized the workers had not hit bedrock. They had struck the hull of a great ship. This was the Newport ship, a merchant vessel from the mid-15th century, and it was in a state of preservation so extraordinary it defied belief. Here was a ship from the very dawn of the Age of Discovery, a contemporary of Christopher Columbus, lying in the dark, wet silt of the River Usk. Built not from local timber but from mighty Iberian oak, its very bones told a story of long-distance trade. This vessel almost certainly plied the routes between Portugal and Britain, carrying goods like wine, salt, and cork. but its final port was not a bustling Atlantic harbor. It was this riverbank over a mile inland from the Bristol Channel. The River Usk is tidal, meaning the water level rises and falls dramatically with the sea. This was the key. Medieval ports were not always on the coast. They were often upstream, sheltered from the worst storms and pirate raids, yet still reachable by the tide. The Newport ship likely came to rest here for repairs, perhaps in a dedicated dock, and was simply never refloated. Abandoned, it was gradually buried by centuries of river silt and forgotten, until the modern city literally built on top of it. Its discovery triggered one of the most complex archaeological rescue missions ever undertaken in Britain. Every single one of its thousands of timbers had to be carefully recorded, lifted, and transported to a purpose-built facility for a multi-million-pound conservation process that would take decades. Why such an immense effort? Because this is not just a shipwreck. It is a time capsule from a pivotal moment, a snapshot of the maritime technology that would soon connect continents. Each timber, each nail, and every artifact found within its hold, from Portuguese coins to a rare leather shoe, tells the story of the everyday connections that wove Europe together on the eve of global exploration. This ship, meant for the vast Atlantic, found its eternal harbor in the mud of a Welsh river, waiting for a future age to understand its quiet significance. The Newport ship, buried by a city, shows how easily a great vessel can be forgotten. But sometimes the land itself conspires to hide a ship's true story, turning a bustling waterfront into a quiet pasture. In the early 1990s, a farmer named John Barland was draining a field near the village of Magga in South Wales when his machinery began to bring up strange, dark timbers. Archaeologists arrived and slowly peeled back the wet clay, revealing not just a few planks but the complete skeleton of an ancient oak boat. This was the Barland's farm boat, a Romano-Celtic vessel dating to around 300 years after the Common Era. It was a practical, flat-bottomed craft about 35 feet long, built in a way that seemed almost primitive yet was ingeniously strong. Its planks were not nailed together but sewn with flexible U-withies, a technique that allowed the hull to flex and twist with the waves. This was no ocean-going ship. It was a local workhorse perfectly designed for the shallow, muddy waters of the Severn estuary, an area known for having the second highest tidal range on the planet. For centuries, this very boat would have been a common sight, ferrying people, livestock, and goods like salt and grain across the treacherous channels and creeks of the Bristol Channel. But its discovery location is what makes it so profound. It was not found on a beach or a riverbank. It was excavated from a flat, productive agricultural field over 2 miles from the modern coastline. How does a boat end up in the middle of a farm? The answer is written in the very soil. When this boat was built, the field was not a field at all. It was the very edge of a vast, silty tidal estuary. The boat likely sank at its mooring or was deliberately abandoned right at the water's edge. Then, over the next 17 centuries, a slow, silent transformation took place. The relentless process of siltation filled in the creeks and inlets. Reeds took root, trapping more sediment. The salty marsh gradually became freshwater wetland, and eventually humans drained and reclaimed the land for pasture. The coastline marched westward, leaving the boat behind, stranded high and dry as the sea retreated. So the Barland's farm boat sits in a museum today, not as a shipwreck but as a permanent landmark. It is a fixed point proving that the map is not the territory. The quiet Welsh field that hid it for so long was once a dynamic, watery highway, a place where the call of seabirds mixed with the shouts of Celtic and Roman traders. This humble vessel forces us to see the landscape as a living, changing entity. It asks us to look at any peaceful meadow and wonder what ancient shorelines lie buried beneath the grass and what other forgotten craft might still be sleeping beneath the plough. The slow burial of a Welsh farm boat reveals a coastline in retreat, but some ships were built to push relentlessly forward into the very teeth of geography's narrowest gates. Off the coast of Turkey, near the site known as Pabasburnu, the broken timbers of a merchant ship lie scattered on the seabed. This wreck is not thousands of years old from the Bronze Age, but from a more familiar era of classical thought, the 5th century before the Common Era, the age of Socrates and Pericles. Yet its story is one of staggering distance and immense risk. This vessel was a Greek merchantman, a floating warehouse of clay amphorae, each one carefully packed with precious wine or olive oil. But it was not found in the safe, familiar waters of the Aegean Sea near Athens or Corinth. Its final resting place is a clue to an epic journey. It lies just outside the entrance to the Dardanelles, the narrow, winding strait that is the sole gateway from the Mediterranean into the Sea of Marmara, and then onward to an even more formidable choke point, the Bosphorus. Beyond that lay the Pontus Euxinus, the Black Sea, to a Greek merchant of this time that was the edge of the known world. The analysis of this ship's remains tells a vivid tale. The style of its amphorae and the techniques used in its construction firmly mark it as Greek. Its cargo was not local. It was bound for, or returning from, the distant colonies that dotted the Black Sea coast, settlements with names like Olbia and Chersonesos in what is now Ukraine and Russia. These were vital sources of grain, timber, and enslaved people for the growing city-states of Greece. To reach them, this captain had to execute a nautical high-wire act. The Dardanelles and Bosphorus are not just narrow passages. They are rivers of the sea with powerful, unpredictable currents that can swiftly dash a vessel against the rocky shores. They were also politically treacherous, controlled by rival states and prone to piracy. Sailing through them required perfect timing, expert local knowledge, and no small amount of courage. The Pabasburnu ship represents that moment of transition. It had either just emerged from the straits into the open Aegean, homeward bound with a hold full of Black Sea grain, or it was gathering its nerve at the threshold, preparing to run the gauntlet with its cargo of Greek wine. Its wreck is a stark monument to the calculation behind ancient wealth. Every amphora recovered from the site represents a conscious gamble, a balance of potential profit against the very real chance of a catastrophic loss. This was not casual trade. It was a high-stakes enterprise that fed cities and fueled empires, all dependent on the strength of a wooden hull and the skill of its crew to navigate geography's most unforgiving doorways. The gamble of the Greek merchant ended on a foreign seabed, but another ship's journey concluded beneath the very foundations of a global symbol. In the summer of 2010, construction crews working on the foundations of the New World Trade Center Tower in Lower Manhattan made a startling find. 30 feet below the bustling streets, in a pit that would soon hold steel and concrete, their machinery scraped against the curved ribs of a wooden ship. Archaeologists were swiftly called to the site, and they began the painstaking process of uncovering what was left of an 18th century vessel, preserved in the wet, anoxic mud of the Hudson River. But this was no riverbank. This ship lay buried in the heart of the modern financial district, hundreds of feet from the current shoreline. The timbers told a clear story. The ship was Dutch-built, crafted from white oak trees that were cut down around 1773, just before the American Revolution. It was a modest trading vessel, not a warship, designed for carrying goods along the coastal and river routes of the New World. Yet its final purpose was not to sail but to sink. This ship, at the end of its useful life, was deliberately scuttled and used as landfill. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Manhattan was expanding. The natural shoreline was a ragged, marshy edge unsuitable for building the docks and warehouses a growing port city needed. So New Yorkers used the simplest material available, rubbish. They filled in the marshes with stones, dirt, broken ceramics, and the hulls of old ships. This vessel was part of that process, a piece of infrastructure sunk to help claim land from the river. Its silent burial created a new piece of Manhattan Island, ground upon which generations would walk, unaware of the maritime skeleton beneath their feet. The discovery is a ghostly layer cake of history. Here lies a Dutch-built ship used in British colonial New York, unearthed during the construction of an American landmark that rose from tragedy. It is a tangible, physical reminder that the world's most famous skyline is not built on bedrock alone, but on the discarded bones of the very maritime commerce that gave the city its life. The ship under the World Trade Center asks a profound question. What other forgotten vessels still lie beneath the asphalt and subway tunnels, holding up the weight of a city that long ago turned its back on the sea? A ship's story does not end when it sinks. In the 1960s, off the northern coast of Cyprus, divers discovered the ghostly outline of a wooden hull resting on the seabed. This was the Kyrenia ship, a Greek merchant vessel from the 4th century before the Common Era, and it was about to begin a second, even longer journey. For years, archaeologists meticulously recovered every piece, from its sturdy planks to its mundane cargo, raising it fragment by fragment from the Mediterranean depths. But its final port was not a harbor. Today, the fully reconstructed ship sits in a quiet museum in the hills overlooking the town of Kyrenia, a permanent resident of the dry, sunlit Cypriot interior, gazing out at the distant blue water it will never sail again. Its preservation is extraordinary. You can walk around its entire hull, seeing the graceful curve of its frame, the precise joinery of its timbers, and even the lead sheathing that once protected it from worms. This is not a theoretical model, it is the actual ship reborn, and within its hold time stands still. There are nearly 400 amphorae, once filled with wine from Rhodes and Samos. There are 9,000 almonds, their shells perfectly intact, and heavy millstones from the volcanic island of Nisyros, used for grinding grain. But more poignant are the personal touches, the small hoard of bronze coins, the wooden spoons and drinking cups, the simple kitchenware used by a crew of 4. We know there were 4 because the bones of the captain's dog were found as well, a silent companion on those long trading runs between the Aegean Islands and the coast of Asia Minor. The Kyrenia ship makes ancient trade intimate. It transforms abstract ideas of Mediterranean commerce into a tangible reality of almonds, millstones, and a dog sleeping in the hold. Its sinking near Cyprus was likely sudden, perhaps from a pirate attack or a storm, but its calm, orderly cargo suggests it was caught unaware, frozen in a moment of routine. Now elevated to a hilltop museum, it serves a new purpose. It is a cultural treasure, carefully removed from the chaotic, eroding sea, and placed where we can study its every detail, where it can tell its story for centuries to come. This act of preservation itself is a kind of voyage, moving a ship from the realm of natural decay into the realm of human memory, ensuring that this humble merchantman and the daily lives it represents will never be lost to the deep a second time. The deliberate preservation of a Greek merchant ship speaks of cultural reverence, but a vessel can also be offered to powers far older than any museum. In the damp, quiet darkness of a Danish bog, a different kind of sacrifice was made. The Nydam bog in southern Denmark is a place of deep, still waters and thick peat, and in the 1860s, workers cutting peat for fuel uncovered something astonishing: the prow of a massive oak boat. This was the Nydam boat, a warship from the 4th century, over 75 feet long, and it had been waiting there for 1,500 years, but it was not wrecked or abandoned. It had been carefully, ceremonially placed in the bog, a deliberate gift to the gods. This vessel is a crucial missing link. Built in the clinker style, with overlapping planks riveted together, it is clearly a direct ancestor of the Viking longships that would dominate Europe centuries later. Yet it predates the Viking Age by over 400 years. Here was proof that the legendary Norse shipbuilding tradition was already highly advanced, capable of producing sleek, fast vessels meant for war and raiding. But the Nydam boat story is not one of conquest on the waves. It never saw the sea. Its only voyage was a solemn, ritual procession from a community's heart to the sacred waters of the bog. Alongside it, archaeologists found a trove of weapons, swords, spears, shields, and even chainmail, all deliberately broken or damaged before being thrown into the water. This was not a burial for a king, but a communal offering likely made after a great victory to thank the gods or to ensure their continued favor. The bog's unique chemistry, acidic and oxygen-poor, acted as a perfect preservative, tanning the oak and iron like leather, saving them from the decay that would have consumed them anywhere else. So this ship rests, a weapon of war transformed into an object of profound spirituality. It forces us to reimagine the relationship between these early Germanic peoples and their environment. The bog was not a wasteland, it was a sacred portal, a place where the human world touched the divine. Sinking such a valuable, labor-intensive object, the product of countless hours of skilled work, was an act of staggering faith. The Nidam boat's final resting place answers one question about shipbuilding evolution, but it raises a deeper, more haunting one. What profound need or terrifying gratitude would compel a people to give up their most powerful weapon, not by using it, but by surrendering it forever to the silent, waiting mud? The silent bogs of Denmark held sacrifices of faith, but across the Atlantic, another kind of offering was being made to a far more tangible god, commerce. In the frigid, sheltered waters of Red Bay, on the remote coast of Labrador in Canada, the bones of a Spanish galleon rest on the seabed. This is the San Juan, a Basque whaling ship that sank in the autumn of 1565. Its location is not just a shipwreck site, it is a ghost town of industry frozen at the very peak of its operation. To understand the staggering distance this ship represents, you must picture its origin. The San Juan was built in the Basque region of northern Spain, along the shores of the Bay of Biscay. Its crew set sail on a voyage of over 3,000 miles, not to explore or to conquer, but to harvest. Their destination was the Strait of Belle Isle, a treacherous, ice-choked passage between Labrador and Newfoundland, where right whales and bowhead whales gathered in massive numbers. The Basques were not casual hunters, they were the oil barons of the 16th century. Whale oil, rendered from thick blubber, was the petroleum of its age, fueling the lamps of Europe, lubricating its machines and making soap. The enterprise at Red Bay was not a seasonal camp, it was a full-scale, early industrial colony. The discovery of the San Juan wreck in the 1970s revealed a complete time capsule. The ship itself, a 300-ton galleon, was found lying on its side, its hull remarkably intact. But the true story was on the shore. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of huge copper cauldrons set in stone furnaces where blubber was boiled down into oil. They found cooperages, workshops where thousands of wooden barrels were built to transport the precious liquid back across the Atlantic. They even discovered the graves of whalers who died far from home. This was a self-contained factory, a brutal and efficient machine for turning living leviathans into a commodity. The San Juan did not sink in a storm on the open ocean. It went down right at the heart of its own operation, tied to a wharf, loaded with hundreds of barrels of oil ready for the return journey to Spain. A sudden gale likely snapped its moorings and sent it to the bottom before it could even begin its voyage home. So this ship lies not just far from its ocean of origin, but embedded in the very infrastructure it helped create. It is a stark monument to the first great wave of European resource extraction in the Americas, one that began not with gold or spices, but with the rendered fat of giants processed in silent, icy coves a world away from the cities it would illuminate. The brutal commerce of the whaling ship was a calculated enterprise, but the next vessel's fate descended into a nightmare of pure human chaos. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1629, the Dutch East India Company ship Batavia struck a coral reef. The sound was not a crash, but a sickening, grinding shudder that woke every soul aboard. They were not in the open sea, but lost on the uncharted Houtman-Abrolhos Islands, a speck of razor-sharp coral and limestone crags off the western coast of Australia. To the 300 people aboard, this was the edge of the world, a landscape more hostile and alien than anything their European minds could have conceived. The ship itself, a magnificent vessel laden with silver and trade goods, began to break apart on the reef. In the frantic scramble, some made it to the few barren, waterless islands, while others clung to the wreckage. The captain and senior officers took the ship's only longboat and embarked on a suicidal 30-day voyage to summon help from the distant port of Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, leaving the majority of survivors stranded. What happened next in their absence is a descent into one of history's most chilling maritime horrors. A junior merchant named Jeronimus Cornelis, a man with radical and twisted beliefs, seized control. He saw not a desperate struggle for survival, but an opportunity. With a cotter of loyal mutineers, he began a systematic massacre of the survivors, murdering over 100 men, women, and children to conserve scarce supplies and to eliminate any opposition to his planned piracy. The islands became a slaughterhouse, a theater of unspeakable acts far from the gaze of any law or civilization. A small group of soldiers, led by the under-merchant Weeb Hayes, managed to escape to a separate island and fortify themselves, becoming the only resistance to Cornelis's reign of terror. When the rescue ship finally returned months later, it found a scene of utter depravity. The mutineers were captured, tried, and executed on the spot, some hanged on the very islands that witnessed their crimes. Today, the physical wreck of the Batavia lies broken on the seabed, but its story lives on inland. The ship's reconstructed stern, a magnificent ornately carved section, along with countless artifacts like the stone portico it was carrying, are displayed in museums in Fremantle and Geraldton, cities miles from the brutal coast. These quiet, climate-controlled galleries hold the tangible evidence of that nightmare, from everyday utensils to the shackles used to restrain the mutineers. The Batavia is more than a shipwreck. It is a dark experiment, a case study of what happens when the thin veneer of society is stripped away by distance and desperation, leaving human nature alone on a barren stage. It forces us to ask not how a ship ended up on a reef, but how civilization itself can sink, leaving only artifacts to whisper of the terror that once washed up on a forgotten shore. The desert necropolis of Abydos holds a fleet that never sailed a single mile. In the blistering sands far from the life-giving Nile, archaeologists uncovered not one, but 14 ancient wooden boats, each buried in its own brick-lined tomb. These vessels date to the very dawn of Egyptian civilization, around 3,000 years before the Common Era, a time when the pyramids were still a distant dream. Each boat was massive, between 50 and 60 feet long, crafted from planks of imported timber and carefully placed in the desert like a soldier in a pharaoh's honor guard. They were not hidden in a rush. Their graves were deliberate architectural statements built above the sand, permanent houses for ships meant for a permanent journey. This fleet is associated with the earliest pharaohs, kings like Khosekemwe, who unified Egypt and sought to project their power into eternity. But why bury a fleet in the desert, over 400 miles south of the Mediterranean Sea and distant from the Nile's main flow? The answer lies not in geography but in cosmology. For these early Egyptians, the afterlife was not a static paradise. It was a dynamic voyage. The pharaoh, a living god, would need to travel alongside the sun god Ra in his celestial bark, fighting through the perils of the night to be reborn at dawn. The 14 boats at Abydos were his convoy. They were not built for the Nile's waters, but for the imagined rivers of the sky and the underworld. Their burial so far from any practical body of water makes their purpose crystal clear. They were symbolic vehicles charged with a sacred duty that transcended physical navigation. This discovery pushes the concept of the ship as a spiritual object to an even grander scale. At Giza, one solar bark served a single pharaoh. At Abydos, an entire fleet was commissioned to serve the concept of kingship itself, ensuring that the ruler's journey, and by extension, the ordered cycle of the cosmos, would continue unbroken. These silent holes in the sand tell us that for the earliest Egyptians, a king's true power was measured not by the lands he controlled in life, but by the vessels he commanded in death, a ghost fleet forever ready to sail across the desert of the stars. While the ghost fleet of Abydos sailed only in myth, a Tudor king's pride met a very real and public end within sight of his own castle walls. The Mary Rose was the jewel of King Henry VIII's navy, a revolutionary warship that had served him faithfully for 34 years. On a July afternoon in 1545, as the king himself watched from the South Sea castle ramparts, the Mary Rose led the English fleet out to engage a French invasion force in the Solent, the narrow strait protecting Portsmouth harbor. The ship, overloaded with heavy guns and hundreds of men, made a sharp turn. A sudden gust of wind caught her sails and she heeled over. The sea rushed through her open lower gun ports, and within minutes the mighty flagship vanished beneath the waves, taking over 500 souls with her. It was a national trauma witnessed by thousands, a catastrophic failure at the moment it was meant to shine. For centuries, the Mary Rose was just a legend, a name on a document and a shape in the mud. Then, in 1982, after one of the most complex maritime archaeology projects ever attempted, her hull broke the surface once more. The raising of the Mary Rose was a global event, a moment where history physically re-emerged. But her journey did not end at the water's edge. Today, she rests in the Mary Rose Museum at Portsmouth Historic Dockyard, a purpose-built, climate-controlled home that keeps her timbers in a permanent state of humidified slumber. This is a warship preserved in a bubble, a battlefield artifact carefully extracted from its context and placed where we can study its every scar and what scars they are. The ship itself is only half the story. The thick silt of the Solent bed acted as a perfect time capsule, preserving an astonishing collection of over 19,000 everyday objects. Here are the bones of the archers, their longbows still beside them, and the unique skeletal evidence of their powerful, asymmetrical physiques. Here are the surgeon's tools, the wooden plates still stacked in the galley, the backgammon boards, the knit combs, and the leather shoes. We hear the sailors' voices through their personal possessions, a wooden flute, a purse of silver pennies, a tankard carved with a lover's name. This is not just a ship, it is a floating cross-section of Tudor England, from the captain's cabin to the common sailor's mess. The Mary Rose's final location, now a museum dry dock, forces a profound shift in perspective. She is no longer a wreck, she is a portrait. Her careful, indoor preservation allows us to ask intimate questions that the open sea would never answer. We can see exactly how a cannon was secured for battle, trace the path a sailor took between decks, and understand the terrifying noise and crowding of a warship under sail. She makes the Tudor world immediate and visceral. Her silent, air-conditioned hall is a far cry from the chaos of the Solent on that July day. But it is in this quiet, controlled space that the true violence of her loss and the vibrant humanity of her crew echo the loudest. The silent, air-conditioned hall of the Mary Rose is a world away from the raw, earthy power of a Norwegian burial mound. In 1904, on a quiet farm near the Oslofjord, a farmer's curiosity broke into a chamber that had been sealed for over 1,000 years. He was not digging for treasure, he was simply expanding his field, but his spade struck ancient, carved wood. What he uncovered would become one of the most breathtaking archaeological discoveries of all time, the Oseberg ship. This was not a wreck, not a vessel lost to storm or battle. It was a deliberate, magnificent tomb placed with immense care inside a massive earthen mound. The ship itself is a masterpiece of Viking artistry, a clinker-built vessel of oak over 70 feet long with an elegant, sweeping prow that curves like a swan's neck. Every inch of it speaks of status, its wood carved with intricate patterns of gripping beasts and interlacing serpents, a floating gallery of Norse mythology. But its most profound mystery lay within. This royal chamber held not a warrior king, but two women of immense rank. Their identities are lost to time, but their status is undeniable. One was elderly, perhaps in her 70s or 80s, the other around 50. They were buried with a collection of goods so lavish it staggers the imagination. Elaborately carved wooden carts and sledges meant for ceremonial processions on land, exquisite textiles including tapestries, chests filled with personal items like shoes and combs. Even the skeletons of more than a dozen horses and several dogs, all sacrificed to accompany them on their final journey. This vessel, for all its seaworthy design, was never meant to touch the water. Its last voyage was a short, solemn procession from the fjord's edge to its prepared mound, where it was buried as a permanent home for the dead. The Oseberg ship redefines the Viking ship's purpose. Yes, it was a tool for exploration and raid, but it was also a potent symbol of dynasty and belief, so central to identity that the wealthiest in society chose it as their eternal resting place. To be buried in a ship was to claim a connection to the very essence of Norse life, the journey itself. Today, the ship resides in the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, lifted from its dark mound and placed under the bright lights of modern reverence. It is a paradox, this seafaring vessel now forever anchored in a concrete hall, far from the salt ere it was built to conquer. Yet in that quiet museum, it continues its voyage, carrying not queens across the 9 worlds, but carrying us across a millennium, offering an intimate, dazzling glimpse into a world where power, art, and the afterlife all sailed under the same carved wooden keel. The Oseberg ship's royal tomb speaks of a culture's deepest beliefs, but another vessel was built not for the afterlife, but for the most lavish indulgence of this one. South of Rome, nestled in the crater of an ancient volcano, lies a small, circular body of water called Lake Nemi. Its calm, deep waters held a secret for nearly 2,000 years. Fishermen's nets would sometimes snag on colossal timbers far below, and locals whispered of a sunken Roman palace. These were not myths. In the 1st century, the notorious Emperor Caligula ordered the construction of 2 gigantic pleasure barges, floating palaces of unimaginable decadence meant solely for his private amusement on this secluded lake. They were engineering marvels. The larger of the 2 was essentially a floating villa over 240 feet long with multiple decks. It featured real marble floors, intricate mosaics, and even a sophisticated plumbing system with lead pipes and bronze taps for running water. Its hull was sheathed in lead and fastened with bronze bolts. These were not warships or merchantmen. They were monuments to excess, designed for banquets, religious ceremonies, and the emperor's whims, forever confined to a lake barely 3 miles across. After Caligula's assassination, the barges were stripped and deliberately scuttled, their memory fading into local legend. For centuries, they were ghosts beneath the water. Then, in a staggering feat of modern engineering in the 1930s, the Italian government made a decision. They would not just dive for the ships, they would move the lake itself. Engineers built a massive system of pumps and began to lower the water level of Lake Nemi, partially draining it to reveal the colossal wrecks sitting in the muddy basin. It was a spectacle, the past literally emerging from the receding waters. The recovery was a triumph. The ships were carefully excavated, their thousands of artifacts preserved, and a grand museum was built right on the lake shore to house them. For a brief, shining moment, these symbols of ancient opulence were safe, displayed for the world to see. But history has a cruel sense of irony. In 1944, during the brutal fighting of the Second World War, the museum was set ablaze. Whether by accident or deliberate act, the flames consumed everything. The exquisite wooden hulls, the marble fittings, the bronze artifacts, all were reduced to ash and twisted metal in a single night. The fire that destroyed them felt like a second sinking, a final, violent erasure. Today, all that remains are the black and white photographs of their recovery, the empty concrete shells of the museum buildings and a few charred fragments. The story of the Nemi ships is therefore a double tragedy. They were vessels of pointless luxury that never tasted the sea, built for a tyrant's pleasure on a hilltop lake. Their recovery was a monumental act of archaeological salvation, pulling them from the deep mud of time, and their loss was a modern catastrophe, a reminder that no artifact, no matter how carefully raised and preserved, is ever truly safe from the fires of the present. They exist now only as a ghostly outline in our historical imagination, a cautionary tale of grandeur built on water and saved from it only to be consumed by fire. Fire and water erased the Nemi ships, but the Mississippi mud held a different kind of warship in a perfect, dark embrace. The USS Cairo was a city-class ironclad, a revolutionary vessel built for the Union Navy, not to fight on the open ocean, but to control the vast, muddy arteries of America. In December of 1862, it was leading a squadron up the Yazoo River, a tangled tributary north of Vicksburg, Mississippi. The mission was to clear Confederate defenses, but the river itself had become a weapon. A hidden, electrically detonated mine, then called a torpedo, erupted beneath the Cairo's wooden hull. Within 12 minutes, the ironclad sank into the brown water, becoming the first ship in history to be sunk by such a device. There it settled, not in the deep sea, but in the soft, preserving silt of a southern river, forgotten for nearly a century. The Yazoo's current slowly buried it, sealing the ironclad in a time capsule of mud. Its rediscovery in the 1950s was a feat of historical detective work, using old maps and probing rods. Then, in 1964, the impossible happened. Sections of the 10,000-ton vessel were painstakingly raised from the riverbed, not from a clear coastal bay, but from a forested, inland waterway. Today, the reassembled USS Cairo sits not on a harbor, but under a protective shelter at the Vicksburg National Military Park, hundreds of winding river miles from the Gulf of Mexico. You can walk around its low, sloped iron sides, still pitted and scarred, and peer into its cavernous interior. The recovery was a miracle of preservation, pulling up not just the ship but the everyday life of its crew. The anaerobic mud saved everything wood, leather, and cloth that would have vanished in seawater. Inside, archaeologists found a sailor's duffel bag with perfectly preserved clothing, wooden dishes, tools, even a pocket knife with its bone handle intact. This is the intimate story of the Civil War, told not from a battlefield but from a sunken crew's quarters. The Cairo makes the concept of riverine warfare concrete. This was not a war of dramatic naval clashes on the horizon, but a grinding, tactical struggle for control of inland supply lines. These ironclads were floating fortresses that brought the war deep into the continent, to places where no ocean-going ship could ever reach. Its final home in a peaceful park is a profound transformation. A weapon of war born for rivers now rests permanently on land, its guns silent, its hull a museum. It asks us to listen to the quiet stories held in the mud, to remember that some of history's most pivotal battles were fought not on famous coasts, but on the dark, forgotten bends of a river, where a new kind of mine could send a new kind of ship to a century of sleep. The silent ironclad in its Mississippi park shows how war reshapes a landscape, but sometimes a ship's most enduring journey is not across water or mud, but directly into the human mind. High on a sun-baked wall of the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, a site deep in the Egyptian desert and far from the life-giving Nile, visitors from 2,000 years ago left a curious mark. They did not carve prayers to the goddess of love and music. Instead, they carefully etched the clear, unmistakable outlines of sailing ships. These are not the grand, official reliefs commissioned by pharaohs. This is ancient graffiti, the spontaneous doodles of pilgrims, priests, or construction workers who passed through this isolated religious complex. The ships they drew are detailed and accurate, showing hulls, masts, and rigging that would have been familiar on the Nile. But here they are frozen in stone, hundreds of miles from any body of water large enough to sail them. This simple act reveals a profound truth about ancient Egypt. The ship was not just a vehicle, it was a fundamental part of the cultural imagination, a symbol so deeply ingrained that it surfaced even in a place of pure desert spirituality. Think of a modern worker spending months at a remote site, perhaps carving a sketch of a car or an airplane on a wall. That image represents connection, a memory of home, or a symbol of movement and power. For those ancient Egyptians at Dendera, the ship was that symbol. Hathor herself was associated with travel, both across the sky and into the afterlife. These graffiti ships might have been votive offerings, a way for a traveler to give thanks for a safe Nile journey that brought them to this temple. Or they could represent the celestial bark of the goddess, a shorthand prayer for her protective voyage. They are mental ships sailing across the stone instead of the river. Their presence in such a dry, inland place makes them, in a way, the farthest traveled of all. They required no timber, no crew, and no current. They sailed on the tide of thought, carried in the minds of people for whom the Nile was the central artery of existence, so essential that its image followed them even into the heart of the desert. These etched lines are more than doodles. They are proof that for this civilization to think of journey, ritual, or the divine was quite literally to think of a ship. The ghost ships of Dendera sailed only in the mind, but the silhouette pressed into an English field was once the very real vessel of a king. In the summer of 1939, as the shadow of a world war fell across Europe, a quiet excavation on a Suffolk estate unearthed a different kind of shadow, one cast by history itself. At a place called Sutton Hoo, archaeologists carefully brushed away the earth from a large burial mound. What they found was not a ship, but its perfect negative image. The 90-foot-long Anglo-Saxon vessel had completely rotted away, but its timbers had left a dark, crisp impression in the sand, like a photograph taken by the earth. Every plank, every rib, every iron rivet had marked its place, creating a stunning ghost ship resting in its own grave. This phantom hull was the centerpiece of a staggering discovery, the burial chamber of an early 7th century king, most likely Redwald of East Anglia. He was laid to rest not with a simple coffin, but within the belly of his ship, a statement of power so profound it defies simple explanation. Think of the immense effort this required. This warship, built for the cold waters of the North Sea, was sailed or rowed up the River Deben. Then, in a feat of communal labor, it was dragged by teams of men and oxen for over a mile, up from the riverbank and across the field to the top of this hill. Its final voyage was on land. There, it was buried under a mound of earth, becoming a permanent island in a sea of grass. But the ship was just the vessel for a greater treasure. Within its spectral outline lay a hoard of artifacts that rewrote our understanding of the so-called Dark Ages. There was a magnificent helmet of iron and bronze, its face masked a fierce, mustachioed guardian. There was a heavy gold belt buckle, intricate jewelry inlaid with garnets and silver bowls from the Byzantine Empire. Most telling of all were the remnants of a purse, its leather long gone, but its 40 gold coins still held in place by a delicate framework. This was not merely a king's grave, it was a calculated display of connection. The coins linked him to the continent, the silver to the Mediterranean, and the craftsmanship to a sophisticated warrior elite. The Sutton Hoo ship burial forces us to reimagine Anglo-Saxon England. This was not a backward, isolated place. It was a society with far-reaching trade networks, deep artistic traditions, and a cosmology where the ship was the ultimate symbol of status and journey, even in death. The king, a leader of a seafaring people, chose to make his eternal home not in a palace, but in the hollowed-out memory of a ship, ensuring his power would sail on, forever anchored in the quiet Suffolk soil. The ghost ship of Sutton Hoo sailed only in memory, but the Phoenicians built an empire from the tangible reality of wood, wind, and wave. While their legendary cities like Tyre and Sidon on the Lebanese coast have crumbled, their true legacy lies scattered on the seabed of the central Mediterranean. Off the coast of the Maltese island of Gozo, the broken timbers of a ship rest in the deep blue silence. This is the Exlendi wreck, a Phoenician merchant vessel from the 7th century before the Common Era, and it is a single point in a constellation of trade that spanned the known world. When this ship sailed, it was not on a short coastal hop. Its home port was over 1,000 miles to the east in the heart of the Levant. Its final cargo, now resting on the seafloor, tells the story of its last ambitious journey. Amphorae that once held wine and olive oil, fine tableware, and raw materials were all packed into its hold, destined for the emerging colonies and trading posts the Phoenicians were establishing across the Mediterranean. This was a delivery ship for a growing commercial network, a floating supply line. The Phoenicians were not just sailors, they were the supreme logistical masters of the ancient world. They perfected the construction of sturdy, rounded merchant ships called goloi, or round ships, designed for maximum cargo capacity on long, open water voyages. They navigated by the stars by day and the North Star by night, venturing where others feared to go. The discovery of wrecks like the Exlendi in Maltese waters is a crucial piece of evidence. Malta itself was a vital way station, a rocky haven midway between Sicily and North Africa. But for a Phoenician captain, this was not a remote destination. It was a familiar checkpoint on a highway his people had charted. From their Levantine homeland, they sailed west, planting colonies on the coasts of Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, and most famously, Carthage. Their ultimate goal lay even farther beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we call the Strait of Gibraltar. There they tapped into the Atlantic, reaching the tin mines of Cornwall in Britain and sailing down the Atlantic coast of Africa. So the amphorae found off Gozo are more than pottery. They are geographic coordinates. Each one represents a voyage of staggering distance and calculated risk, connecting the cedar forests of Lebanon to the silver mines of Spain and the purple dye workshops of North Africa. The Phoenicians carried not just goods but ideas, the alphabet, metalworking techniques, and artistic styles, weaving the disparate coasts of the Mediterranean into a single, interconnected economic zone. Their ships were the needles and the sea was the thread. The Exlendi wreck, therefore, is a fragment of a web. It sits in the central Mediterranean not as an endpoint, but as a silent witness to a vessel caught in the middle of its endless, looping journey. A journey that truly defined the ancient world by making the vast, terrifying sea into a predictable, profitable road. The Phoenician network was a web of profit, but in the cold north, a king's discarded warship became the literal bedrock of a capital. Stockholm's old town, a labyrinth of islands and bridges, holds a secret beneath its cobblestones. In 1930, construction crews digging near the Riddarholm church in the very heart of the city struck a massive wooden obstacle. They had uncovered the stern of a 16th century warship buried deep in the thick blue clay. This vessel was no ceremonial offering. Its timbers were stout, built for battle, and dendrochronology later revealed they were felled in the 1540s, right in the middle of the reign of King Gustav Vasa, the founder of modern Sweden. But this ship never saw a glorious naval engagement. Its fate was far more utilitarian. Like the vessel under the World Trade Center, the Riddarholm ship was used as landfill. At the end of its serviceable life, it was likely towed to a marshy spot along the city's edge, deliberately sunk, and then buried under tons of earth and stone to create stable ground for new construction. This was urban planning in the age of wood and muscle. A city confined to islands needed to grow, and the most readily available bulk material was often the city's own discarded infrastructure. Obsolete ships, their hulls already a dense matrix of timber, were perfect for the task, so a vessel designed to dominate the Baltic Sea, to carry cannons and soldiers, ended its days as a foundation, silently supporting the weight of houses, churches, and eventually the modern city that forgot it. Its discovery is a stark reminder of a simple, brutal truth. The march of progress has always required a foundation, and sometimes that foundation is made from the very tools that built the world before it. The Riddarholm's ship rests forever in the dark, cut off from the water it was born to conquer, holding up a city that now sails on an ocean of commerce it could never have imagined. A king's warship can become a city's foundation, but the most enduring vessels are often the simplest. In the clear, cold waters of Lake Mendota in Wisconsin, archaeologists recently uncovered a fleet that sailed a different kind of sea. During routine surveys in 2021 and 22, sonar and divers located not one, but several ancient dugout canoes resting in the deep mud of the lake bed. The oldest of them was crafted from a single, hollowed-out log an astonishing 4,500 years ago. To put that in perspective, this canoe was already ancient when the Great Pyramid of Giza was under construction. It is a relic from a time when human societies in North America were building monumental earthworks and complex trade networks, all without the wheel or metal tools. These canoes were not lost in some dramatic storm. They were carefully stored, perhaps anchored in shallow water near a village site, and over centuries they slowly filled with sediment and sank, preserved in the lake's oxygen-poor environment like time capsules in a refrigerator. Each one is a masterpiece of practical engineering, shaped by fire and stone tools to create a stable, buoyant craft perfectly suited to its world. That world was not an ocean coast, but an immense interior landscape of interconnected lakes and rivers. For the Native American cultures of the region, ancestors of the Ho-Chunk and other nations, these waterways were not barriers, they were highways. A dugout canoe was the equivalent of a family pickup truck, a vital tool for daily survival and connection. It would have been used for spearfishing in the deep, cold parts of the lake, for setting nets, for harvesting wild rice from the marshes in autumn, and for traveling to seasonal camps or to trade with neighboring communities. The discovery of multiple canoes from different eras all in one place suggests this was a persistent, favored location for a village across millennia. Think of the scene. A person living here 4,000 years ago would step into a canoe identical in basic form to one used by their descendants 2,000 years later. They would paddle across the same lake under the same sun, fishing in the same spots. The continuity is breathtaking. These canoes rewrite the map of early North America. They prove that sophisticated maritime technology and an intimate, reliant relationship with aquatic resources flourished in the continent's heartland, thousands of miles from any ocean influence. This was not a primitive or isolated existence. It was a rich, adaptive lifeway built around the rhythm of freshwater. The canoes of Lake Mendota are humble, but their message is profound. They tell us that some of the most important voyages in human history were not about crossing vast, empty oceans to discover new lands, but about knowing a single, familiar lake so deeply that its waters became home. But the structure of the Bremen cog itself tells a deeper story of daily survival. Stepping aboard this vessel was not like boarding a sleek warship. It was entering a floating wooden warehouse, a damp, cramped world of constant motion and shared hardship. The hold was a cavernous space, but it was not for the crew. It was reserved entirely for cargo, packed tight with barrels of salted fish, bales of wool, or sacks of grain. The men lived and worked on the single, open deck above, exposed to the elements day and night. Their shelter was minimal, perhaps a small, temporary tent of oiled canvas stretched over a portion of the deck during a storm. Their world was defined by the ship's simple, brutal architecture. The flat bottom that allowed it to settle on a riverbed also made it roll terribly in open sea swells, a nauseating reality for every voyage. The high sides that protected from waves also trapped the smells of tar, wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the bilge water sloshing below. Every item recovered from the wreck adds a sensory detail to this picture. The wooden plates show us communal meals, likely a monotonous diet of hardtack, salted meat, and dried peas, washed down with beer as fresh water was too precious to drink. The barrels were not just containers, they were furniture, seats, and tables. And then there are the personal artifacts, the quiet signatures of individual lives. A single leather shoe, lost or discarded, hints at the man who wore it. A carefully repaired tool speaks of a sailor's pride in his kit. Perhaps most telling is the small, carved wooden figurine found on the wreck. Was it a child's toy brought by a sailor thinking of home, or was it a votive offering, a plea for protection nailed near the mast? This object, more than any other, breaks the abstraction of medieval trade. It was carried by a person with fears and hopes, gripping it in the dark during a North Sea gale. The hierarchy on board was strict and clear. At the top was the ship's master, a combination of captain, merchant, and legal representative. He was responsible for navigation, trade, and discipline. Beneath him were the skilled mariners, the helmsman, and the boatswain, who knew the sails and ropes like their own hands. And then came the common sailors, the muscle of the operation, who hauled lines, manned the pumps, and loaded cargo. Theirs was a life of relentless labor, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. The perils were ever present. A storm in the North Sea could snap a mast or drive the cog onto a lee shore in hours. Piracy was a constant threat, not from romantic outlaws, but from rival merchants or even privateers with letters of marque from a king. And then there was the silent enemy, disease. Scurvy from lack of fresh food, infections from minor injuries, and crowded conditions could sicken a crew as effectively as any storm. The Bremen cog makes this life tangible. It was not a grand adventure, but a grueling profession. The conversations on that deck were likely about the wind, the price of wool in London, and the hope for a safe berth. The routine was dictated by the tides and the seasons. This ship did not carry kings or explorers. It carried the gritty, essential pulse of medieval Europe, a pulse measured in barrels of salt and bales of cloth, sustained by the calloused hands of men whose names are lost to history, but whose world is preserved in the waterlogged timbers of a riverbank. The Vossa's ornate carvings may tell a story of glory, but her hull tells the true tale, a silent witness to a cascade of fatal errors. To understand her swift plunge, we must become forensic engineers, examining the evidence left in the timbers. The primary flaw was a catastrophic imbalance. King Gustavus Adolphus demanded a ship of unprecedented power, with 64 heavy bronze cannons arranged on 2 full gun decks. This was an extraordinary amount of firepower for a vessel of her size, and those cannons represented immense weight placed perilously high above the waterline. Think of a tall, narrow bookcase. Fill the top shelves with heavy encyclopedias, and the entire structure becomes unstable, prone to tipping with the slightest nudge. The Vasa was that bookcase. Her hull was simply too narrow and shallow to support the towering castle of wood and metal built upon it. She was, in nautical terms, dangerously top-heavy with a high center of gravity. Compounding this fundamental design error was the relentless pressure of politics and war. Sweden was engaged in a bitter conflict in the Baltic, and the king was impatient for his new symbol of dominance. Historical records suggest that the shipwrights, aware of the instability, may have conducted a basic test. They ordered 30 men to run side to side across the deck to see how much the ship rocked. According to some accounts, the test had to be halted after just 3 passes because the vessel was rolling so violently it risked capsizing right at the dock. Yet, in the face of this terrifying demonstration, the launch proceeded. Why? The admiral in charge, fearful of the king's wrath, reportedly remained silent. The order to sail was given, so on that calm August day, as the Vasa caught her first breeze, the physics were unforgiving. A gentle gust heeled the ship over to port. Because she was so unstable, she did not right herself, she kept leaning. the lower gun ports open and ready for a salute dipped below the water's surface. The sea poured in, a torrent through the very holes meant for her guns. In moments, the inrush of water sealed her fate, adding irreversible weight to her low side. She sank in full view of a horrified Stockholm, not in a stormy sea, but in a sheltered harbor, in less water than her own mast was tall. The mud of the Baltic then performed its own act of preservation, cradling the wreck in a cold, dark, oxygen-free embrace that kept her wooden bones and painted sculptures intact for 3 centuries. This was not merely a shipwreck, it was a perfectly preserved crime scene, a lesson in the terrible cost when ambition outruns the laws of physics and when fear stifles the voice of reason. The Ulubyoran's cargo was not just a collection of goods, it was a political atlas carved in copper and amber. Every item in its hold whispers the name of a distant kingdom, a specific mine, or a royal workshop, allowing us to chart the ship's likely journey and, by extension, the entire interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age. The 10 tons of copper ingots, their distinctive oxhide shape a trademark, point directly to the island of Cyprus, known in ancient texts as Alashia, a powerhouse of metallurgy. The precious tin, essential for making bronze, presents a deeper mystery. Its origin could be the distant mountains of Afghanistan, reached through Mesopotamian middlemen, or perhaps sources in central Anatolia in modern Turkey. Either possibility speaks of a supply chain stretching thousands of miles overland before the metal ever reached a port. Then there is the ebony, a dense black wood that could only have come from the tropical forests of Nubia in present-day Sudan, a region firmly under the thumb of the Egyptian pharaohs. And most astonishing of all, the Baltic amber beads. These golden fragments began as fossilized tree resin in the pine forests of Scandinavia, then traveled south through a chain of hand-to-hand exchanges across the European continent before finally being loaded onto this Levantine ship. So we can trace a probable route. The voyage likely began in a port like Ugarit on the Syrian coast, a bustling hub where Egyptian, Hittite, and Mesopotamian interests converged. From there, the ship sailed to Cyprus to take on its primary cargo of copper. It then turned north, perhaps calling at a port in Anatolia to pick up tin before sailing west into the Aegean Sea. It might have stopped at the Minoan palace of Knossos on Crete, a major redistribution center, before continuing toward the Greek mainland, destined for a Mycenaean palace like Pylos or Mycenae itself. This single vessel was a floating microcosm of international diplomacy. In its hold, the wealth of Egypt met the metals of Cyprus, the luxury goods of Canaan, and the exotic materials of the north. It connected the court of Pharaoh Akhenaten with the court of the Hittite great king and the Wanaks, the lords of the Mycenaean citadels. This was globalization 3,300 years before the term was invented, a delicate web of gift exchange, royal correspondence, and licensed merchants that bound empires together in a tense, prosperous equilibrium. The Ulubyoran's tragic end on that Turkish reef did not just sink a ship, it froze a moment of breathtaking connectivity, offering us a tangible map to a world we once could only read about on crumbling clay tablets. Rescuing a ship from the mud is only the first step in a decades-long race against decay. For the Newport ship pulled from its Welsh riverbank grave, the real challenge began the moment its timbers tasted the air. Each of the 2,500 oak planks and frames was saturated, its cellular structure swollen with water that had supported it for centuries. Exposed to the open atmosphere, that same water would evaporate, causing the wood to shrink, warp, and crumble into dust within days. So the first rule was simple: keep it wet. The timbers were immediately moved into a custom-built conservation center, where they were stored in giant misting tunnels, a perpetual artificial rainforest fighting the dry modern world. For years, teams of archaeologists and conservators worked in this humid environment, painstakingly cleaning each piece of silt and rust, mapping every tool mark and nail hole, and assigning it a unique identity in a vast three-dimensional puzzle. But misting was only a holding action. The true salvation came from a chemical first developed for industrial uses, polyethylene glycol or PEG. This waxy substance is the cornerstone of modern waterlogged wood conservation. The process is a patient molecular heist. The ship's timbers were submerged in giant heated tanks filled with a gradually increasing concentration of PEG solution. Over years, molecule by molecule, the PEG diffused into the wood, pushing out the water within the cell walls and replacing it. When the treatment was finally complete and the wood slowly dried, the PEG solidified, acting as an internal scaffold that prevented the cells from collapsing. It was a transformation on an invisible scale, turning a fragile, water-logged sponge into a stable, waxy monument. Alongside this physical preservation, a digital twin was born. Every timber was laser scanned, creating a perfect three-dimensional record. This digital model allowed archaeologists to test theories of assembly virtually, to see how frames connected to planks long before attempting the physical reconstruction. It revealed stresses, tool signatures, and construction sequences invisible to the naked eye. This marriage of old and new, of chemistry and computer science, defines modern maritime archaeology. The team working on the Newport ship is not digging for treasure, they are practicing a form of extreme historical medicine. Their work is measured not in seasons, but in careers, a quiet, dedicated effort to outwit time itself. The ship in its conservation hall is no longer a relic. It is a patient slowly being cured of its centuries in the dark, waiting for the day it can stand again, not on the River Usk, but as a testament to the lengths we will go to reclaim a single, silent witness from the past. The horror on the Houtman Abrolhos Islands began not with violence, but with a terrible calculation. With the captain and senior officers gone on their desperate 30-day voyage for help, the 280 survivors were scattered across a handful of tiny, waterless coral cays. They had salvaged some food and water from the wreck, but supplies were desperately finite. Into this vacuum of authority stepped Jeronimus Cornelis. He was not a sailor, but a junior merchant and apothecary, a man with radical religious ideas and a personality warped by ambition. He saw the situation not as a crisis to manage, but as an opportunity to seize. Quickly, he gathered a cotter of loyal followers, mostly soldiers and sailors who saw advantage in aligning with a new, ruthless order. His first move was strategic. Under the pretext of searching for water sources, Cornelis systematically separated the survivors. He sent large groups, including the loyal soldiers, to other islands, effectively exiling any potential opposition. He then consolidated his power on the main island, which he named Batavia's Graveyard, with a core group of about 45 mutineers. With his opposition scattered and his inner circle armed, Cornelis revealed his true plan. He would eliminate all but a handful of survivors, conserving all supplies for his own men. Their goal was no longer rescue but piracy. They would await the return of the rescue ship, overwhelm it, and use it to begin a life of lawless plunder on the high seas. The massacre began methodically. Groups of survivors were lured to the water's edge under false pretenses and then bludgeoned or stabbed to death. Others were drowned. The mutineers showed no mercy, killing men, women, and children alike. They developed a chilling routine, drinking wine to steel their nerves before each night's slaughter. The islands, already a barren hellscape, became an open-air charnel house, the silence broken only by the cries of the victims and the crash of the surf. Yet, on a separate island called West Wallaby, a resistance was forming. A group of soldiers led by Weeb Hayes, who had been among those exiled by Cornelis, had miraculously found a small, natural source of fresh water. They also discovered that their island had a population of small, edible wallabies and some seals. While Cornelis's group starved and descended into further brutality, Hayes's men thrived. They built a small stone fort from coral blocks and fashioned crude weapons. When Cornelis, desperate for their water and food, finally launched an attack with his armed mutineers in 2 stolen shallops, he was met with organized, desperate defense. In a series of skirmishes, the outnumbered but better-fed soldiers under Hayes repelled the attackers, even capturing Cornelis himself. The mutiny was not over, but its heart had been captured. The final act of this nightmare arrived with the sail on the horizon. The rescue ship, the Sardom, commanded by the returning senior officer, sailed into the archipelago months after the wreck. Weeb Hayes managed to get a message to them warning of the mutiny. The Sardom's crew, armed and prepared, landed and swiftly rounded up the remaining mutineers. A quick on-site trial was held. Cornelis and his chief lieutenants had their hands chopped off before being hanged on the very islands they had stained with blood. Others were taken back to Batavia for trial, where more were executed. The Batavia story is not one of a ship found far from the sea, but of a society shipwrecked within itself. The vessel broke apart on a reef, but the human community aboard shattered on the sharper rocks of ambition, fear, and moral collapse. It asks a question that echoes far beyond those coral cays: what fragile threads hold our civility together, and how quickly do they unravel when the map ends and no one is watching? Forensic science can give a skeleton a name, a face, and a life story. Within the preserved wreck of the Mary Rose, the bones of nearly 200 men were found, a complete cross-section of Tudor society from the aristocratic officers to the young ship's boys. Through modern osteoarchaeology, these silent remains have begun to speak, telling intimate stories of hardship, skill, and sudden catastrophe. Take the archers, for example. Dozens of longbows were recovered, some over 6 feet tall, weapons of immense power. The skeletons of the men who wielded them tell a matching tale. Many show a distinctive asymmetry with enlarged left arms and shoulder joints, and often a curvature of the spine, a permanent physical signature of a lifetime spent drawing a 150-pound bow. These were not just soldiers, they were elite athletes, their bodies shaped by their craft from a young age. Then there is the cook, identified by his location in the galley area near the brick oven. His remains were found surrounded by his tools, copper pots, wooden plates, and even a barrel containing the bones of cattle and pigs, the last meal he never finished preparing. We can almost hear the clamor of his workspace, smell the smoke and stew, and feel the heat from the oven on a crowded lower deck. Another poignant figure is the carpenter, discovered with his chest of tools still beside him, chisels and planes ready for the endless task of repairing a wooden ship at sea. His bones show the wear and tear of a life of manual labor, but also the pride of a specialist whose skill kept the entire vessel afloat. Analysis of the crew's teeth and bones reveals their harsh world. Their diet was heavy in salted meat and hard biscuit, leading to signs of scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies. Many skeletons show healed fractures and chronic injuries, the accumulated toll of life aboard a working warship, where a fall from the rigging or a slipping cargo block was a constant danger. Isotope analysis of their teeth even tells us where they grew up. While many were from southern England, others came from as far away as southern Europe, perhaps Spain or Italy, showing the Mary Rose was crewed by a surprisingly international group of men, all bound together under the Tudor flag. This personal evidence transforms the historical event into a human tragedy. We are not just learning about a ship that sank, we are meeting the individuals who sank with it. The terror of those final minutes becomes visceral. The ship heels, water explodes through the gun ports, and in the roaring darkness, each man faces his end. The archer loses his grip on his bow, the cook is swept from his galley, the carpenter drops his tools. Their lives, marked by routine and discipline, are shattered in an instant. The silt of the Solent then performs its grim duty, cradling them in a cold embrace for 437 years. When we look at the reconstructed faces from these skulls or examine the simple objects they held, we are not looking at history. We are making eye contact with it. The Merry Rose is no longer merely King Henry's warship. It is a submerged village, a community of individuals whose final moments were preserved by the very sea that claimed them, offering us a hauntingly direct connection to the flesh and blood reality of the Tudor age. The Khufu ship's discovery was only the beginning of a second, more delicate voyage. Inside that sealed limestone pit, the pharaoh's vessel lay not as a whole ship, but as a perfect disassembled puzzle. The ancient builders had carefully taken it apart, plank by plank, stacking its 1,224 pieces of fragrant Lebanese cedar in 13 orderly layers. For 45 centuries, it waited in that dark, dry silence, a kit of parts for the afterlife. Unwrapping this kit fell to a man named Ahmed Youssef Mustafa, the chief restorer of the Egyptian Department of Antiquities. His task was staggering: to reassemble a ship whose construction methods had been forgotten for millennia, using only the clues left in the wood itself. No manual existed, no diagrams survived. He had only the timbers and their tool marks as his guide. Mustafa and his team began a painstaking process of documentation, studying each piece, noting every curvature, every hole, every trace of the original adze. They realized the ship was built in a technique known as lash-through, a method far more sophisticated than it sounds. The planks were not nailed or pegged. Instead, the ancient shipwrights had drilled matching holes along the edges of the cedar planks. They then threaded ropes made of hafa grass through these holes, literally sewing the hull together like a giant wooden basket. The internal framework was added later, lashed into place to provide strength and shape. To reconstruct it, Mustafa knew he could not use modern shortcuts. He insisted on replicating the ancient techniques exactly, using the same types of tools and materials. This meant his team had to relearn the lost art of sewing a ship. They practiced on small models, learning the precise tensions needed, understanding how the cedar would flex and settle. The reconstruction became an act of experimental archaeology, a physical conversation across time. It took over a decade of meticulous, patient work. The result is the breathtaking vessel you can see today in its museum at the base of the Great Pyramid. Walking around it, you can still see the stitching, the elegant lines of the papyrus-shaped prow, the cabin that would have sheltered the pharaoh's spirit. Yet for all this brilliance, profound mysteries cling to the cedar planks. The biggest question is one of purpose. Was this solar bark ever a real boat? Some scholars point to wear patterns on the hull, suggesting it might have been used at least once, perhaps in a magnificent funeral procession on the Nile, carrying Khufu's mummy to his pyramid before its ritual burial. Others argue the wear could be from construction or testing, and that its sacred duty was purely symbolic, meant only for the celestial waters. Then there is the mystery of the craftsmanship itself. How did they achieve such precision? The planks are not uniform, they are expertly shaped, each one a unique piece of a complex three-dimensional puzzle. The ropes had to be soaked to tighten perfectly as they dried, pulling the hull into a watertight seal. This was not primitive technology, it was a masterclass in woodworking and engineering, all accomplished with copper tools and human skill. Ahmed Youssef Mustafa's decade of devotion did more than rebuild a ship. It rebuilt our understanding. By refusing to use a single nail, by choosing to listen to the wood, he allowed the ancient builders to speak through their work. The Khufu ship now stands complete, but it sails on in our imagination, forever poised between the river it might have once touched and the starry sky it was always meant to navigate. The bones from the Estonian meadow hold more than just stories of battle, they hold the very genetic code of the men who fell. Decades after the Salmi ships were first uncovered, scientists turned to a new kind of evidence, one locked inside the warrior's teeth and skeletal fragments. Advanced DNA analysis performed on the remains yielded a result that was both startling and deeply human. These 40-odd men were not a random collection of mercenaries or a crew pressed into service. They were closely related, a band of kinsmen. The genetic markers suggested they were brothers, half-brothers, and cousins, all hailing from the same small community in what is now east-central Sweden. This single scientific finding transforms the entire excavation. The group is no longer an anonymous war party, it is a family expedition. Imagine the scene generations ago in a Swedish village by a fjord. A chieftain, perhaps an elder brother or an uncle, decides to mount an ambitious raid eastward across the Baltic. He calls upon his kin, his most trusted and bound by blood. Sons, nephews, and cousins answer the call. They build or commandeer 2 ships, and together, this tight-knit unit sets sail into the unknown, bound by loyalty deeper than any paycheck. The science goes further. Isotope analysis of the enamel in their teeth acts as a chemical passport, recording the geology of the water they drank as children. The signatures match the region around Lake Mälaren in Sweden, confirming their origin story written in chemistry. But it also revealed their diet was rich in protein, likely from fish and meat, indicating they came from a place of relative prosperity, not desperation. These were not outcasts, they were likely the privileged sons of landowners or local elites, the very individuals with the resources to fund such a voyage and the status to lead it. This genetic and chemical portrait forces a major rethink of early Viking Age society. It strongly suggests that the first wave of Viking expansion was not a disorganized scramble, but was often conducted by these familial war bands. The social unit was the key. Raiding was a high-risk, high-reward family business. Success meant shared glory and wealth flowing back to their home community, strengthening the entire clan's position. Failure, as at Salmi, meant a catastrophic generational loss. The intimacy of this discovery is almost overwhelming. We can now picture these young men who shared childhood meals and memories fighting back to back on a foreign beach. Their burial together in the ships with their weapons and gaming pieces makes a new, poignant sense. They lived as a brotherhood, and in death, their community ensured they would journey to the afterlife together as a family. The cold data of a DNA sequence warms into a heartbreaking narrative, a reminder that behind every artifact, behind every strategic expansion in the history books, there were individuals who loved, quarreled, and ultimately died alongside the people they called family. To sacrifice a warship was to surrender a kingdom's strength. The Nidam boat was not merely discarded, it was given, an act of staggering economic and spiritual weight. Consider the sheer effort required, felling the massive oaks shaping the planks, forging the thousands of iron rivets, and assembling the 75-foot hull represented hundreds of days of skilled labor from an entire community. This vessel was a concentration of wealth and technical knowledge, the ultimate tool for projecting power across the water. Yet its final voyage ended not in conquest, but in a quiet, deliberate submersion into the dark waters of the bog. This practice, repeated across Scandinavia for centuries, speaks to a world where the material and spiritual realms were intimately, transactionally linked. The gods demanded the very best humanity could produce. After a great victory, a chieftain might lead a procession to the bog's edge, his warriors following with the spoils of battle. The Nidam boat itself, perhaps the very vessel that carried them to triumph, would be filled with a grim cargo. Swords were bent, spear shafts snapped, shields splintered. This ritual killing of the weapons was crucial. It released their power, transferring the essence of victory from the human realm to the divine. Cauldrons used in feasts, symbols of communal wealth and hospitality, might be added, their rims deliberately staved in. Then, amid chanting and perhaps the sacrifice of animals, the great ship would be pushed into the stagnant water. It would sink slowly, swallowed by the peat, an offering placed directly into the hands of the gods below. Who were these deities? While written records are scant, later Norse mythology points to powerful candidates. Odin, the god of war, poetry, and hidden knowledge, was a receiver of sacrifices, especially those tied to battle and sovereignty. A chieftain offering his finest warship might be seeking Odin's favor for future campaigns or thanking him for a past victory. Another potent possibility is Nerthus, an earth goddess of fertility and peace described by the Roman historian Tacitus. Her sacred grove was on an island, and her chariot was bathed in a hidden lake by slaves who were then drowned. The imagery of a vehicle being cleansed in water with a deadly price paid eerily mirrors the bog deposits. The offering of a ship, a vehicle of travel and connection, to an earth goddess could be a plea for fertility, for protection during seasonal changes, or for maintaining the balance between the community and the land that sustained it. The act itself, far from being a loss, was a profound investment. For the chieftain, it was a public display of piety and wealth so immense he could afford to give it away. It cemented his authority, proving he had the favor of the gods and the loyalty of his people to undertake such a costly enterprise. For the community, it was a collective ritual that reinforced social bonds and shared identity. They had built the ship together, fought from it together, and now they surrendered it together, ensuring their continued prosperity and harmony with the unpredictable forces that governed their world. The Nidam boat, therefore, is more than an archaeological treasure. It is a frozen moment of dialogue. Its hull is a prayer made of oak and iron, a message sent into the deep, dark water, asking for protection, power, and continuity. A conversation between humanity and the divine, where the most valuable thing you owned was the only thing worth saying. The transatlantic voyage was only the beginning of their labor. Once the Basque galleons like the San Juan reached the coves of Labrador and Newfoundland, the real work commenced, transforming these remote shores into a greasy, smoky factory. Each ship carried not just sailors but an entire mobile industry. The crews would immediately establish a traniera or shore station, a temporary but highly organized settlement centered around massive copper cauldrons set into stone furnaces. The goal was singular: to turn the mountainous blubber of a right whale into pure, valuable oil. The hunt itself was a deadly ballet conducted from small, agile rowboats called chalupas. These were launched from the mother ship, each manned by a harpooner and a crew of rowers. The technique was ancient and perilous. They would row silently up to a sleeping whale, and the harpooner would drive a heavy iron harpoon attached to a long rope deep into the creature's flesh. This was not a killing blow, but an anchor. The wounded whale would dive and run, towing the fragile chalupa in a terrifying ride called the Nantucket sleigh ride, until it was exhausted from blood loss and could be finished with lances. Then came the flensing, perhaps the most brutal work imaginable. The colossal carcass was towed to the shore station and secured in the shallow water. Men wearing spiked boots would climb onto the floating giant, slicing the thick blubber away in long, spiraling strips with huge flensing knives. This blubber, often pieces weighing several tons, was then hauled onto wooden platforms by block and tackle, where teams with hand knives would chop it into smaller pieces called Bible leaves due to their thin, rectangular shape. These were tossed into the simmering copper trypots, rendering the fat into clear oil. The air would be thick with a greasy, pungent smoke, the constant roar of the fires, and the shouts of men working in a relentless, bloody rhythm from dawn until dusk. This was not a solitary endeavor, it was intensely cooperative. The crew operated as a single machine with specialized roles, from the skilled harpooners and steersmen in the chalupas to the choppers, fire tenders, and coopers who built and repaired the endless stream of barrels needed to hold the oil. A single whale could yield over 40 barrels, and a successful season could fill a galleon's hold with thousands. This operation was a staggering feat of logistics and labor, all to feed a distant continent's hunger for light and cleanliness. The Basque whalers created a blueprint that would be copied for centuries, a model of industrial extraction that treated a distant ocean not as a wilderness, but as a resource to be harvested, one barrel of oil at a time, with the ship as its vital, beating heart. The ironclad was a fortress that had to learn to swim. The Cairo's design was a radical departure from the graceful, wooden warships that had ruled the oceans for centuries. Its hull was a blunt, rectangular box, flat-bottomed to navigate the shallow, unpredictable rivers of the American interior. Rising from this ungainly base was its defining feature, the casemate. This was a sloped, armored box made of heavy oak timbers, sheathed in 2.5 inches of iron plate. The sloping sides were a stroke of defensive genius designed to deflect enemy cannonballs, sending them ricocheting harmlessly into the sky or the water. Inside this dark, hot iron box were the ship's weapons, up to 13 heavy guns, including massive 42-pounder smoothbores and rifled cannons that could punch through brick fortifications. This was not a ship built for the open sea, where its flat bottom would roll terribly in the swells. It was a specialized tool for a new kind of war, a siege engine that could move. Its power came from a throbbing steam engine, turning a central paddle wheel mounted in a protective well at the stern. The engine consumed enormous amounts of wood, stripped from the very riverbanks the ship was fighting to control, and filled the cramped interior with heat, smoke, and the deafening clank of machinery. The crew lived and worked in a claustrophobic metal world, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke, sweat, and gunpowder. They were protected from the fire of enemy forts, but they were also trapped inside their own moving prison, their vision limited to narrow gun ports and the world outside reduced to sounds and impact. Yet for all its imposing strength, the Cairo harbored a fatal, hidden vulnerability. Its greatest threat did not come from the cannons on the bluffs, but from invisible weapons lurking beneath the brown, muddy water. The Confederates, outgunned on the water, turned to ingenuity and desperation. They developed the first practical underwater mines, which they called torpedoes. These were often simple wooden barrels or glass demijohns, filled with black powder and sealed with waterproof pitch. They were anchored to the riverbed and connected to the shore by long, insulated copper wires. A hidden observer, watching the approach of an ironclad through a spyglass, could complete an electrical circuit at the perfect moment, detonating the mine directly under the ship's hull. The Cairo's flat bottom and shallow draft, perfect for river travel, made it an ideal target. On that December morning, the hidden mine did not strike the ship's armored sides. It exploded against its unarmored wooden keel. The blast tore a hole large enough to drive a wagon through, and the river poured in with unstoppable force. In just 12 minutes, the technological marvel, the unsinkable fortress, was on the river bottom. The Cairo's swift end marked a terrifying evolution in warfare. It proved that a weapon costing a few dollars could destroy a vessel worth over 100,000. The age of the wooden warship was over, but the age of the invisible, automated kill had already begun, transforming the quiet waterways into fields of hidden, mechanical death. The two women in the Oseberg mound were not equals in death. The elder woman, around 80 years old, commanded a presence even in her skeletal remains. Her spine showed severe arthritis, a lifetime of strain perhaps from weaving or from the physical demands of leadership. A small, benign tumor in her skull suggested she may have suffered from chronic headaches, a pain she endured for years. This was a person who lived a very long life by Viking standards, accumulating immense authority and respect. Many scholars believe she was Queen Asa, the grandmother of Harald Fairhair, the first king to unify Norway. The sagas speak of Asa as a formidable political player, a queen who orchestrated vengeance and secured her dynasty's power. If this identification is correct, then the Oseberg ship is not just a royal tomb, it is the burial of a founding matriarch, a woman who shaped a kingdom. But then, who was the second woman, the one in her early 50s? Her bones tell a different story. They show no signs of the degenerative joint disease that plagued the elder. Instead, they reveal a well-built, robust individual. A deep cut on her collarbone, fully healed, hints at a past violent encounter, perhaps from a raid or an accident. The most chilling detail comes from her teeth. Isotope analysis indicates that in the last decade of her life, her diet changed dramatically. shifting from the protein-rich fare of the elite to a much simpler, grain-based diet. This could be evidence of a fall from grace, or it could point to something more deliberate. Was she a loyal companion, a sister or daughter who chose to follow the queen into the afterlife? Or was she a slave, a trail, selected for the solemn duty of accompanying her mistress? The shift in her diet might reflect her final months being prepared, intentionally separated and marked for this ultimate sacrifice. The grave goods surrounding them offer no simple answer, only a louder proclamation of their collective status. The ship itself was a masterpiece, but the items within were a curated universe for the afterlife. The ornate wooden cart with its elaborate carvings was not for practical travel. It was a ceremonial vehicle, likely used in religious processions, connecting the queen to the goddess Frigid, who herself rode a chariot. The exquisitely woven tapestries, fragments of which survived, depicted scenes of ritual and procession, a visual guide for the journey ahead. There were 4 beds suggesting attendance and a wealth of personal items, from imported Persian silk to a simple wooden bucket. This was not a hasty burial. It was a meticulously staged tableau designed to project power and ensure comfort in the next world. The presence of the younger woman is the central enigma. If she was a sacrificial slave, her inclusion was both an honor and an act of ultimate control, demonstrating the queen's power over life and death. If she was a relative, it speaks to a profound bond, a belief that the family unit must remain intact beyond the grave. This dual burial forces us to discard simplistic images of Viking society. Here, at its apex, women could wield extraordinary religious and political authority. The Oseberg funeral was an event that mobilized an entire community, a spectacle that reinforced social order and dynastic legitimacy. The 2 skeletons lying side by side in that carved ship represent a partnership we may never fully understand, a silent dialogue between power and companionship, between a queen's command and another woman's final, mysterious voyage. The artists who painted boats on the Saharan cliffs were not dreaming of distant seas. They were sketching their own backyard. Their work is a direct eyewitness account of a world that has utterly vanished, a world climatologists now call the Green Sahara or the African Humid Period. For roughly 5,000 years, beginning around 10,000 years before the present, the landscape we know as the largest hot desert on Earth was transformed. The monsoon rains, which today fall over Central Africa, pushed hundreds of miles farther north. The result was a dramatic ecological rebirth. Where there is now only endless sand and rock, there were sprawling grasslands dotted with acacia trees and baobabs. Freshwater lakes, some as large as modern-day Lake Erie, shimmered in the basins. Rivers carved channels through the plains, creating networks that supported life. This was a vibrant savanna ecosystem, teeming with animals we now associate with regions far to the south: giraffes, elephants, hippos, crocodiles, and antelope. The people who lived here were not lost travelers. They were pastoralists, hunters, and fishermen, thriving in a lush, watered world. The boats they painted were not symbols of aspiration, but tools of daily life, lightweight reed vessels used for fishing in those lakes and navigating those rivers. The Cave of the Swimmers in Egypt's Gilf Kebir Plateau captures this reality with stunning clarity, figures gliding through blue water surrounded by aquatic life. This art is a snapshot, not a fantasy. It was their normal. So what powered this incredible transformation, and what caused it to end? The engine was a subtle shift in the Earth's dance around the sun. Changes in the planet's orbit and tilt, known as Milankovitch cycles, gradually increased the amount of solar energy reaching the northern hemisphere during the summer months. This heated the landmass of North Africa, causing the air above it to rise. That rising air created a low-pressure system that pulled the moisture-laden monsoon winds northward from the Atlantic Ocean and the Congo Basin. The rains followed, greening the desert in a process that took centuries but would have been observable across human generations. communities grew, cultures developed intricate rock art traditions, and life was organized around the reliable presence of water. Then the cycle reversed. As the orbital parameters slowly shifted again, the summer sunlight diminished. The land cooled, the monsoons weakened and retreated south. The lakes began to evaporate faster than the rains could replenish them. The rivers dried up, leaving behind their ghostly channels called wadis. The grasslands withered and the relentless desert sands advanced. This desertification was not a sudden catastrophe, but a creeping, inexorable change that unfolded over generations. The people of the Green Sahara faced a slow-motion crisis. They would have watched their familiar world shrink. The lakes where they fished became salt pans. The rivers where they paddled their boats became dusty gullies. The animals they hunted migrated away or died out. Their response was migration, following the retreating water south toward the Sahel and the Nile Valley, taking their stories and their skills with them. But they left their memories on the walls. The boat paintings, therefore, are stranded twice over. First, the physical boats themselves were abandoned as the waters vanished, their reeds crumbling to dust. Then the cultural memory of those boats was left behind, etched in stone in a landscape that could no longer support them. They became artifacts of a climate past, permanent monuments to a time when humanity's greatest works could be washed away not by flood, but by a profound and permanent drought. These images challenge our deepest assumptions about place and permanence. They ask us to look at the most arid, lifeless expanse on the planet and see, etched in stone, the proof that it was once a land of lakes, a place where the most sensible thing a person could do was paint a picture of a boat. The Kyrenia ship was old and the sea had taken its toll. Analysis of its timbers reveals a long working life, a vessel that had been patched and repaired many times. The hull showed evidence of ancient damage carefully mended, a testament to a captain who valued his ship too much to let it retire. This was not a gleaming new merchantman on a maiden voyage, but a seasoned workhorse, its oak planks seasoned by countless journeys, its crew intimately familiar with every creak and groan. On its final trip, it was engaged in the most ordinary of tasks, a routine circuit along the coast of Anatolia, the modern Turkish shoreline, hopping between islands like Samos and Rhodes before heading to Cyprus. Its cargo was the lifeblood of the ancient economy, not treasure but sustenance. We can see the crew at the dock, sweating under the Mediterranean sun as they rolled heavy clay amphorae up the gangplank. Each jar was packed with wine from the vineyards of Rhodes or precious olive oil. They hauled sacks holding 9,000 almonds, a valuable source of protein and oil. And they loaded heavy volcanic millstones from the island of Niceros, rough-hewn discs that would be used to grind grain in a distant town. This was a floating grocery store, a delivery vehicle for the essentials of daily life. The journey would have been familiar, the winds predictable, the landmarks well known. The captain likely had made this run dozens of times. He carried a small hoard of bronze coins, his operating capital, and perhaps a wooden spoon and a simple fishing weight for the long days between ports. It was all so normal, so utterly routine. Then disaster struck near the coast of Cyprus. The nature of the sinking remains a mystery, but the clues point to a sudden, violent end. The ship went down quickly, with its cargo largely intact and in good order. This suggests it was not slowly overwhelmed by a leak, but succumbed to a catastrophic event. A sudden, fierce storm common in the eastern Mediterranean could have swamped the old vessel, its patched hull finally giving way to a punishing wave. Or perhaps the shadow of a pirate galley appeared on the horizon. In an age where banditry at sea was a constant threat, a slow, laden merchantman like the Kyrenia ship was a prime target. A pirate ramming or boarding action could have holed the hull, sending it to the bottom before the attackers could even loot its mundane cargo. The crew of 4 and the captain's small dog whose bones were found had no time to save themselves. Their voyage ended not in a heroic battle or a legendary tempest, but in the brutal, ordinary violence of the ancient sea. The profound power of the Kyrenia ship lies in this very mundanity. Its reconstructed hull in that hillside museum does not speak of kings or conquests. It speaks of almonds and millstones, of a wooden spoon lost in the hold, of a small coin that bought a meal in a port tavern. It makes the ancient world human, scaling it down to the size of a merchant's ledger and a sailor's simple meal. This ship connects us not to myths, but to the repetitive, risky labor that built civilizations, one sack of almonds, one jar of wine at a time. Its tragedy is quiet, a reminder that history is built not only by the extraordinary, but by millions of ordinary journeys that simply ended one day, leaving their stories waiting in the dark. The ship's timbers held a secret calendar. To unlock it, scientists turned to dendrochronology, the study of tree rings. Each year, a tree adds a new layer of growth, a ring whose width is a direct record of that year's climate. A good year with ample rain creates a wide ring, a drought year leaves a narrow one. This pattern of fat and thin rings is unique to a specific time and place, like a fingerprint for a period of history. By taking core samples from the ship's white oak planks, researchers could read this fingerprint. They sanded the cores until the rings stood out in stark contrast. Then they measured the sequence under a microscope, plotting the precise widths on a graph. The next step was matching. They compared this unknown sequence against master chronologies, vast databases built from studying thousands of dated trees across North America and Europe. It was a meticulous search for a pattern match, and they found one. The rings in the ship's wood ended with the growth season of 1773. This was the smoking gun, the year the trees were cut down. The pattern itself was the final clue. It matched master chronologies from the region around Philadelphia. So this ship, found buried in New York, was built from trees that grew in the forests of Pennsylvania. The implications are profound. This vessel was not an old Dutch relic reused by the British. It was a brand new ship constructed in an American colony on the eve of revolution. Its timbers were felled, shaped, and assembled just as the political climate was reaching a boiling point, a product of a thriving colonial industry about to declare its independence. This scientific dating transforms the ship from a curious artifact into a precise historical marker. It tells us that colonial shipyards were not just building small coastal sloops, they were producing substantial ocean-going vessels capable of Atlantic trade. The white oak from Pennsylvania's interior was likely floated down the Delaware River to Philadelphia's bustling shipyards, where it was crafted into a hull destined for commerce. This ship likely carried goods between American ports, or perhaps to the Caribbean, part of the complex, often illicit trade networks that defied British mercantile laws. Its eventual fate as landfill in New York tells another story, one of rapid urban expansion and the practical disposal of assets. The tree rings are a silent witness to all of it. They recorded the droughts and rainy seasons the trees endured in the Pennsylvania woods. They were shaped by colonial axes and adzes. They sailed through the turbulent years leading to 1776. And finally, they came to rest in the darkness beneath Manhattan, a wooden archive preserving the growth rings of a nation just about to be born. That U-stitched hull is a perfect example of a technology that sounds primitive, but is in fact a masterclass in adaptation. Stone plank construction is one of humanity's oldest and most reliable methods of boat building. The process was deceptively simple. Shipwrights would first shape the planks, then drill a series of carefully aligned holes along their edges. They would take long, flexible branches of yew or hazel, soaked to make them pliable, and thread them back and forth through these holes, literally lashing the planks together like stitching a giant leather shoe. The seams were then caulked with moss or animal hair soaked in pine tar to make them watertight. The result was not a rigid cage but a flexible, living hull. This was its greatest advantage. On a river like the Severn, with its powerful tidal bore and constantly shifting sandbanks, flexibility was survival. A nailed hull, if it struck a submerged log or settled awkwardly on a rough riverbed, could crack a plank or spring a fatal leak. A sewn hull, however, could twist and flex with the impact, absorbing the shock and often remaining intact. It was a boat built to forgive the mistakes of a difficult environment, but this forgiveness came at a cost. The constant flexing and the wear of water would eventually degrade the organic lashings. Unlike an iron nail that could last for decades, withies would rot and need replacement every few years. Maintaining a sewn boat was a continuous, labor-intensive cycle of inspection and repair, a commitment woven into the very ownership of the vessel. This places the Barland's Farm boat at a fascinating crossroads in naval history. It represents the tail end of the shell-first tradition, where the whole shape is defined by the planks themselves, which are joined edge to edge before any internal framework is added. The stitching holds everything together, and the frames are inserted later for reinforcement. This is the opposite of the frame-first method that would come to dominate medieval and modern shipbuilding, where a skeletal framework of ribs is built first, and the planks are then nailed onto that rigid skeleton. The sewn boat is a transitional genius, a shell-first design that uses organic lashings to achieve a level of flexibility that nailed planks on a frame could not. So this humble river workboat, buried in a Welsh field, is far more than a lost artifact. It is a preserved moment of engineering philosophy. Its stitches are a direct dialogue between the builder and the river, a choice that prioritized resilience over permanence and adaptability over brute strength. In its quiet, sewn-together bones, we can read the very character of the waters it sailed, and the pragmatic, ingenious minds of the people who trusted their lives to its flexible embrace. This fleet of 14 was a cosmic engine, a machine built not for the water but for time itself. To understand why, we must listen to the oldest religious texts in the world, the pyramid texts, which were first inscribed on the walls of royal tombs just a few centuries after these boats were buried. These spells reveal a breathtaking vision of the afterlife. The Egyptians did not see death as an end, but as a perilous transition, a journey the deceased pharaoh had to make to join the gods. And the primary mode of transport for that journey was always a boat. The sun god Ra sailed his solar bark across the sky by day, and then through the treacherous, monster-filled underworld by night to be reborn at dawn. The pharaoh's ultimate goal was to secure a place in that divine crew, to sail alongside Ra for eternity. The Abydos fleet made this ambition literal and multiplied. It provided the king not with one vessel, but with an entire squadron for his celestial voyage. Each boat might have represented a different stage of the journey, a different hour of the night, or a different aspect of the king's divine power. They were his convoy through the afterlife, but this symbolism was rooted in the very landscape of Egypt itself. For the Egyptians, the world was a mirror. The Nile River that flowed from south to north through their land was the earthly reflection of a celestial river that flowed through the sky. The Milky Way was often seen as this heavenly Nile. The sun's journey was a boat ride on that starry water. So, a boat was not merely a useful tool, it was a fundamental metaphysical concept. It was the vehicle that connected the earthly realm to the divine, the means of crossing from one state of being to another. By burying these boats in the desert at Abydos, a site sacred to Osiris, the god of the dead and resurrection, the early pharaohs were performing an act of profound symmetry. They were placing real, physical boats in the dry earth so that their spiritual doubles could sail on the eternal river above. The desert here was not an obstacle, it was a launch pad. This act was about regeneration on the grandest scale possible. The king's journey ensured more than his personal immortality. It guaranteed the renewal of Maat, the fundamental order of the universe. His successful voyage meant the sun would rise again, the Nile would flood, the crops would grow, and the kingdom would endure. The 14 silent hulls at Abydos were therefore a collective prayer for cosmic continuity. They transformed a lonely stretch of desert into a sacred dry dock, where the most important voyage a civilization could conceive was perpetually ready to begin, its destination not a foreign shore but the endless cycle of dawn. The sand itself remembered what the wood had forgotten. When the great burial mound at Sutton was first opened, the excavators faced a breathtaking paradox. They had found the richest Anglo-Saxon grave ever discovered, but the ship that was its centerpiece had vanished. Over 13 centuries, the oak planks and iron rivets had completely decayed, eaten away by the acidic soil. What remained was not a ship but its perfect negative image, a 90-foot-long stain in the yellow sand. This stain, however, was a photograph in earth holding an incredible level of detail. The pressure of the buried timbers had compacted the sand beneath them, while the soil that filtered into the space left by the rotting wood remained looser and darker. The result was a crisp, color-coded blueprint. You could see the gentle curve of the hull, the precise lines where planks had butted together, and even the rust stains from thousands of iron rivets, each one marking its exact position. The ship was gone, but its ghost was perfectly preserved. To capture this phantom, the archaeologists, led by Charles Phillips and Basil Brown, performed a kind of reverse excavation. Instead of digging something out, they poured something in. They carefully mixed plaster of Paris to a creamy consistency and gently poured it into the dark stain that defined the ship's form. The liquid plaster flowed into every cavity left by the rotted wood, filling the spaces where the keel, ribs, and planks had been. It seeped around the rust marks of the rivets. As it set, it captured everything: the exact dimensions, the construction techniques, even the tool marks from the original shipwright's adzes. When the surrounding sand was later brushed away, what emerged was a white plaster cast of a vanished warship. This ghostly positive, made from the negative impression, was a three-dimensional record of a structure that no longer physically existed. It was a conversation with an echo. From this cast, every vital statistic could be taken. The ship was clinker-built with overlapping planks, a design directly descended from the Norse tradition. The rivet pattern revealed the spacing of the internal frames. The sheer size and robustness confirmed it was a true ocean-going vessel, capable of crossing the North Sea. This plaster ghost provided all the engineering data of a real shipwreck. It told archaeologists how the ship was built, how it was meant to move through the water, and how much labor and resources its construction demanded, all without a single piece of the original timber surviving. This method is a cornerstone of archaeological inference, the science of building knowledge from shadows. The Sutton Hoo ship cast proves that preservation is not always about saving the object itself. Sometimes it is about saving the memory of its form, the empty space it left behind, which can be more eloquent than the crumbled original. The most solid truth we have about this king's vessel is made from plaster, a fragile white shell holding the shape of a mighty absence, a reminder that sometimes what is missing speaks the loudest of all. Uncovering a ship in a city is like performing heart surgery on a patient who is still running a marathon. The excavation of the Riddarholm ship was a race against the relentless clock of modern development. Construction crews had a schedule to meet, a new building was waiting to rise, and the archaeological team had only a narrow window to extract every possible secret from the mud before the site was sealed forever. This is the defining tension of urban archaeology. You are not working in a remote, controlled field. You are operating in the dense, living body of a city, surrounded by the constant thunder of traffic, the maze of underground pipes and cables, and the immense pressure of budgets. Every minute of delay costs money, and every discovery must be balanced against the needs of the present. For the team at Riddarholm, this meant adopting a strategy of rapid, precise documentation. They could not leisurely excavate the entire ship. Instead, they focused on carefully exposing key sections, taking thousands of photographs from every angle, making detailed drawings and collecting samples of wood, soil, and any small finds. It was archaeological triage, saving the information if not the entire object. This high-pressure salvage, however, yields a unique kind of insight. A ship buried in a city is not just a relic, it is a permanent surveyor's stake. It marks with absolute precision the historical shoreline at the moment it was buried. When we find a vessel like the Riddarholm ship, we are finding the exact edge of the city at a specific date. We can then trace how that edge moved over centuries. Each buried hull is a contour line on a map of urban growth, showing how Stockholm, like so many coastal cities, expanded by claiming land from the water. The process was pragmatic and often messy. Marshy, unstable shorelines were useless for building. The simplest way to create solid ground was to fill them with whatever was heavy and available, and a decommissioned ship's hull was perfect bulk material. So a warship that once defended the realm ended its service as a foundation for a merchant's warehouse or a craftsman's workshop. Urban archaeologists use these chance discoveries, these interruptions in the construction process, to read the city's biography in reverse. A ship found under a bank tells of a financial district built on a field in cove. A vessel beneath a train station speaks of a transportation hub replacing old docks. Each one is a time capsule, yes, but more importantly, it is a punctuation mark in the long sentence of a city's development. It captures the moment the city turned its back on the water, swallowing its own maritime infrastructure to build anew. These buried ships are silent witnesses to our own relentless forward motion, reminding us that the ground beneath our feet is not fixed, but a layered story of ambition, utility, and forgotten voyages, each one paved over to make way for the next. The canoes of Lake Mendota are more than ancient wood, they are living relatives. For the Ho-Chunk nation whose ancestors crafted and paddled these vessels, each discovery is a profound reconnection. These are not simply artifacts to be studied behind glass. They are tangible links to a continuous heritage, physical proof of a deep, enduring relationship with the lakes and rivers of Wisconsin that stretches back over 140 generations. The knowledge of how to build such a canoe, which tree to select, how to shape it with fire and stone, and how to navigate by the stars and seasonal currents, was passed down through oral tradition. Finding these canoes validates that knowledge, turning stories and teachings into something you can touch. It confirms what the Ho-Chunk have always known, that their people have been masterful stewards of this watery landscape since time immemorial. This reframes the entire discovery. It is not a window into a lost and finished past, but a chapter in an ongoing story of resilience and belonging. The lake did not just preserve boats, it preserved a legacy. Recognizing this, the archaeologists involved took a crucial step. They understood that the most important story these canoes tell is not theirs to tell alone. So they initiated a true collaboration, working directly with tribal historians, elders, and representatives from the Ho-Chunk nation. This partnership changed everything about the process. Tribal members were consulted on every decision, from the careful recovery of the fragile timbers to the plans for their long-term preservation. Their insights provided context that no textbook could offer, interpreting tool marks and construction techniques through the lens of traditional knowledge. This collaborative model respects the canoes not merely as historical data, but as ancestral objects with deep spiritual and cultural significance. It ensures that the process of study is also a process of honoring. The goal is no longer just to extract information, but to care for these vessels in a way that respects the people for whom they are a direct inheritance. This partnership is healing a historical divide. For too long, archaeology in the Americas was conducted on indigenous communities, not with them. Objects were removed, studied in isolation, and displayed without context, severing the living connection. The work on Lake Mendota strives for a different path, one of shared authority and mutual respect. It acknowledges that the full meaning of the canoes can only be understood when scientific inquiry walks alongside traditional knowledge. So the oldest canoe, dating back 4,500 years, does more than reset a timeline. It anchors a living culture to its homeland with undeniable physicality. It allows a Ho-Chunk citizen today to look out over the blue expanse of Lake Mendota and know, with certainty, that their ancestors looked out over the same water from the very same kind of boat. The canoe becomes a bridge across millennia, not to a forgotten people but to a vibrant, enduring one. This collaborative recovery is itself a kind of voyage, navigating the currents of history and memory to bring an ancestral gift carefully back to the light. Their mastery of the sea was not a single innovation but a complete system. To dominate both war and commerce, the Phoenicians developed two distinct, purpose-built vessels, each a marvel of its kind. For battle, they perfected the bireme galley, a sleek, predatory craft powered by two banks of oarsmen, a design that gave it devastating speed and maneuverability. This was the warship that could enforce their will on rebellious colonies or clear pirate-infested straits. But for the true engine of their empire, we must look to the humble gallows, the round ship. This was the opposite of the sleek galley, a broad-beamed, single-masted cargo vessel with a rounded hull built for one thing: capacity. Its design prioritized the safe transport of tons of goods over long distances, the maritime equivalent of a modern supertanker. It was in ships like these that the Phoenicians moved the raw materials of the ancient world, their stability allowing them to weather Atlantic gales on voyages that would have shattered lesser craft. Yet even the finest ship is useless without a captain who knows where he is going. Here, the Phoenicians demonstrated their true genius, not in shipbuilding but in wayfinding. They were the original celestial navigators. By day, they used the sun's arc. By night, they sailed by the stars, with the North Star, their fixed point in the turning sky, guiding them north and south. They kept detailed mental logs of coastal landmarks, soundings, and seasonal wind patterns, knowledge so valuable it was a state secret. This allowed them to execute voyages of staggering audacity. From their home ports of Tyre and Sidon, they would sail west across the Mediterranean, pass through the Pillars of Hercules at Gibraltar, and then turn north into the terrifying, fog-bound Atlantic. Their destination was the Cassiterides, the Tin Islands, which historians believe were the shores of Cornwall in southwestern Britain. They braved these unknown waters for one heavy, dull grey metal, tin, the essential ingredient for making bronze. This was not casual exploration. This was a deliberate, sustained supply chain spanning over 2,000 miles, all conducted without a compass or a map. Their most legendary product, however, came not from distant mines, but from the shallow coastal waters of their own homeland. Tyrian purple dye was the ultimate status symbol of the ancient world, a color so vivid and color-fast it became synonymous with royalty and divine authority. The process of making it was a guarded industrial secret of almost mythical complexity. It was derived from the mucus secretions of a particular sea snail, the murex. Thousands of these snails were harvested, crushed, and left to ferment in vast, stinking vats. The resulting liquid was then slowly exposed to sunlight, where it underwent a miraculous chemical transformation, shifting from yellow to green to blue, and finally settling into that deep, rich purple. The smell of the production sites was said to be unbearable, but the result was worth a fortune. A single gram of true Tyrian purple could cost the equivalent of a laborer's yearly wage. A robe dyed entirely in this color was a display of wealth so extravagant it was literally priceless. Every Phoenician shipwreck we discover, like the Ex-Lendi wreck off Malta, is a physical node in this vast network. Its amphorae and artifacts are the scattered footprints of a civilization that thought on an oceanic scale. They did not just trade goods, they traded in connections, planting colonies like Carthage not as isolated outposts, but as fortified links in a chain that stretched from the cedars of Lebanon to the tin of Britain and beyond. Their identity was not rooted in a vast inland empire, but in the wooden decks of their ships and the star charts in their minds. They prove that a culture can be so thoroughly maritime that its entire history, its wealth, and its legacy are written not on parchment, but in the silent patterns of trade routes across the deep blue sea. The true insanity of the Nemi ships lies not in their size but in their amenities. These were not simple floating platforms, they were self-contained, palatial estates engineered for every conceivable comfort. Ancient historians like Suetonius whispered of heated marble floors, a staggering luxury in the 1st century, likely achieved through a hypocaust system where hot air from furnaces circulated beneath the floors. They wrote of elaborate baths with sophisticated plumbing, bronze pipes feeding hot and cold running water to pools and fountains. There were reportedly lush rooftop gardens with soil deep enough for trees and flowering plants, a floating oasis of green on the blue lake. Some accounts even mention small, ornate temples on deck, housing statues of gods that were engineered to rotate, perhaps to face the sun or follow a ritual procession. This was a level of opulence that would have been extraordinary in a hillside villa, let alone on a vessel confined to a lake barely 3 miles wide. So why build such impossible things? Caligula's motivations were a volatile mix of absolute power, religious obsession, and unchecked hedonism. Some scholars suggest the ships were floating shrines to the goddess Diana, whose sacred grove was near Lake Nemi. Caligula, who declared himself a living god, may have used these vessels for elaborate religious ceremonies, positioning himself at the center of divine worship on the water. Others see them as the ultimate party yachts, stages for the emperor's notorious and cruel banquets, where political enemies could be humiliated and excess knew no bounds. The most compelling explanation is that they were all these things at once. For an emperor like Caligula, the distinction between religious rite, political theater, and personal amusement had vanished. The ships were a physical manifestation of a mind that recognized no limits. If he wished to dine in a garden while sailing, engineers would make it so. If he wanted statues to turn as he walked past, artisans would find a way. The lake itself became a private, controlled universe, a stage where he could act out any fantasy, far from the critical eyes of the Roman Senate and populace. Their location is the final, telling detail. He did not build them on the Tiber River in Rome or anchor them in the Bay of Naples where the elite vacationed. He built them on this secluded crater lake, a place shrouded in myth and mystery. This was not for public display. It was a private playground, a nautical bubble where the normal rules of reality, expense, and even physics could be suspended by imperial command. The Nemi ships, therefore, represent the ultimate divorce of maritime technology from any practical purpose. They were engineering marvels in the service of a single man's whim, a fleet whose only mission was to feed the grandiosity of a ruler who believed he could command not just an empire, but the very nature of what a ship could be. They sailed on a sea of pure power, and their fate would be as dramatic as their creation. These marks on the stone are not random. To decipher them, we must listen to the echoes of similar messages left across the ancient world. From the quarries of Egypt to the porticos of Roman Ostia, sailors and travelers have always felt the urge to carve their passage into permanence. At the great temple of Kam Ombo, built along a bend in the Nile, the walls are covered with incised images of boats, often accompanied by simple hieroglyphs naming a captain or a crew. Egyptologists widely interpret these as votive offerings, prayers of thanks carved by grateful sailors who had just survived the treacherous cataracts upstream. The ship was the perfect symbol of that gratitude, a representation of the very vessel that carried them through danger. The dendera graffiti could easily serve the same purpose, a traveler's humble thank you note to Hathor, the goddess who protected journeys, etched after a safe trip down river to her desert sanctuary. But not every carving requires such solemnity. Look at the simple, almost childlike sketches, the ones that show a basic hull and mast with little detail. These could be the ancient equivalent of a worker's doodle, etched during a break by a laborer or a bored pilgrim thinking of home, using the familiar shape of a boat to pass the time. The impulse is timeless, the need to say, "I was here," yet some of the ship graffiti is surprisingly precise, showing rigging, steering oars, and deck structures with careful accuracy. This raises another fascinating possibility, that these were not just pictures but practical records. Could they have been left by shipwrights or merchants, schematic diagrams used for instruction, for boasting about a new design, or even for recording a vessel's specifications for ritual purposes? In a world without paper blueprints, a temple wall could serve as a communal notebook, and we cannot dismiss the magical dimension. In ancient Egyptian thought, the act of creating an image held power. To draw a ship on the wall of a temple was, in a sense, to consecrate it, to place it under the divine protection of the goddess. The image itself could become a permanent charm, ensuring safe voyages for all who saw it or for the soul of the person who carved it. So these silent sketches on the desert cliffs are a layered conversation. They are personal signatures and communal prayers, idle sketches and sacred diagrams. They transform a static temple wall into a dynamic document, a guestbook signed not with names but with the single most important tool in the carver's life. In these simple lines, the universal human need to make a mark meets the specific, profound reality of a civilization that could not conceive of life, death, or the divine without a vessel to carry them. The amphorae on that Greek merchantman were not just containers, they were passports stamped in clay. Each one with its distinctive shape, handle form, and sometimes a painted mark or seal, declared a precise origin. A slender, graceful amphora with a mushroom-shaped rim might have journeyed from the island of Chios, famed for its rich, dark wine that was a favorite among the elite. A heavier, more robust jar with a thick, rolled rim could have come from Thassos, an island whose vineyards were so celebrated its coins featured a bunch of grapes. For an ancient consumer, the shape of the amphora was the brand label, a guarantee of taste and status before a single drop was poured. This system of identification was crucial because Greek wine was not a uniform product. It was a diverse, regional craft, as varied as the soils and slopes of the countless islands and coastal hills where grapes were grown. Transporting it was a delicate art. After fermentation, the wine was poured into these ceramic amphorae. The interior was often coated with pine resin, which acted as a sealant, imparting a distinctive flavor that modern palates might find surprising but which was the expected taste of the ancient world. The pointed base of the amphora was not a design flaw, it was functional. It allowed the jars to be stacked securely in the curved hull of a ship, nestled in beds of sand or straw to prevent shifting during the long, turbulent voyage. On a ship like the one at Pabas Bernu, hundreds of these pointed jars would have been carefully packed, turning the dark hold into a forest of inverted clay cones, each one holding the essence of a sun-drenched vineyard. But wine was far more than a pleasant beverage in the Greek world. It was the lubricant of society, the centerpiece of the symposium, the all-male drinking party where philosophy, politics, and poetry flowed as freely as the wine itself. It was a ritual offering to the gods, a medicine, and a fundamental unit of trade. A ship laden with amphorae was not carrying mere refreshment. It was transporting the very substance of Greek social and religious life to distant shores. For the colonies springing up around the Black Sea, places like Olbia or Chersonesos, this imported wine was a tangible link to the culture of the homeland. To drink wine from Chios at a feast on the Ukrainian steppe was to assert your Hellenic identity, to participate in a shared civilization despite the vast distance. The merchantman, therefore, was a cultural courier. Its voyage transformed an agricultural product into a symbol of belonging. Every amphora sold in a Black Sea port did more than quench a thirst. It reinforced a worldview, connecting a settler on the edge of the known world back to the vineyards, the rituals, and the conversations of mainland Greece. The ship's journey through the treacherous straits was a gamble not just on profit, but on the enduring power of a shared custom, proving that some of the strongest bonds in the ancient world were sealed not with treaties, but with the taste of wine carried in a humble clay jar. The Vosa's true voyage began the moment it left the water. After its dramatic salvage, the ship faced a new, invisible enemy, the air itself. Centuries in the cold, dark, oxygen-free mud had preserved its timbers perfectly, but exposure to the modern atmosphere threatened to destroy them within decades. The wood, saturated with water, would dry, shrink, and crack into dust. Its vibrant painted sculptures would fade and flake away. Saving this ship required more than a museum, it demanded a machine for time. The solution is the Vasa Museum itself, a colossal, climate-controlled cocoon built around the ship. The entire structure is a preservation chamber, maintaining a constant temperature of around 18 degrees Celsius and a precise 65% humidity. This specific, cool dampness mimics the conditions of the seabed, allowing the waterlogged oak to dry so slowly over centuries that its cellular structure will not collapse. The air is filtered to remove pollutants, and the lighting is carefully controlled to a low, non-damaging level, leaving the Great Hall in a perpetual, respectful twilight. This is not a static display, it is a high-stakes medical ward where the patient is a 333-year-old warship. The conservation work never stops. One of the most critical projects has been the systematic replacement of the ship's original iron bolts. Over 6,000 of these iron fasteners, which hold the hull together, are slowly corroding. As they rust, they expand with tremendous force, splitting the ancient oak planks from the inside like a silent, metallic cancer. Teams of conservators work in a painstaking, decades-long operation to remove each iron bolt one by one and replace it with a custom-made bolt of stainless steel, a material that will not corrode. It is a monumental task, a form of archaeological surgery performed on a scale never before attempted. Every decision is a balance between preservation and authenticity. They must save the ship, but they also strive to preserve as much of the original material and appearance as possible. This ongoing battle underscores a profound truth about these stranded giants. Raising a ship from the deep is a moment of triumph, but it is only the beginning. The greater challenge is the forever after. A vessel like the Vasa can never truly go home to the sea, so we must build it a new, artificial ocean of stable air and constant vigilance. Its museum is not merely a building, it is a life support system, a permanent commitment by one civilization to keep another's greatest failure and its most intimate story alive for centuries to come. The ship that sailed for 20 minutes now requires an eternal, watchful guardianship, forever anchored in the dry dock of our care. For 4,500 years, a second ghost has lain waiting beside the Great Pyramid. While its famous sister, the Khufu ship, was raised and reassembled in a nearby museum, this vessel remains sealed in its limestone pit, a dark twin slumbering in the sand. It is the last great unopened treasure of Giza and our final ship. In 2011, archaeologists finally confirmed its presence using a tiny endoscopic camera, snaking a flexible probe through a crack in the pit's massive stone cover. The grainy images sent back were breathtaking. There, in the absolute darkness, lay cedar planks, their wood grain still visible, and coils of rope, looking as if they had been left there yesterday. It was a perfect, untouched time capsule, a second solar bark for the pharaoh Khufu, preserved in a state of suspended animation. The decision was made not to excavate immediately. The first ship's restoration took a decade, and the science of preservation has advanced dramatically since the 1950s. To open this pit now would be to begin a century-long commitment, a project for future generations of archaeologists equipped with tools we can only imagine. So the pit remains closed, a deliberate act of patience, a promise to the past that we will only disturb it when we are absolutely certain we can do it justice. This waiting ship holds the potential to answer questions its sister could not. The first boat was found disassembled and stacked. Is the second ship also in pieces, or could it be intact, fully assembled within its tomb? The endoscopic glimpse showed timbers lying in apparent disorder, but that could be the careful, layered stacking the ancient workers used. The quality of the ropes, the exact arrangement of the planks, and even microscopic traces of ritual offerings could all be preserved in that still, dry air. Most compellingly, this second boat might resolve the great debate about these vessels. Were they ever real, functional boats used in the pharaoh's funeral procession on the Nile? Or were they purely spiritual vessels built only for the cosmic journey? A fully assembled hull in the pit would strongly suggest a ceremonial use on water. A meticulous, identical stacking would point toward a symbolic kit of parts for the afterlife. The answer lies in the dark, just a few meters from where millions of tourists stand. This unexcavated ship brings our journey of 50 vessels to a fitting close. We began with the first Khufu ship, a masterpiece pulled from the desert to rewrite our understanding of faith and engineering. We end with its hidden twin, a reminder that for every mystery solved, another is waiting in the wings. These 50 ships scattered across deserts, fields, and city foundations prove that the human story is not bound by coastlines. Our ambitions, our beliefs, and our very identities have always traveled on the idea of the vessel, carrying us to places no ocean could ever reach. The second solar boat sleeps on, a silent promise that the map is never finished, and that the next great discovery might not be under the sea, but waiting beneath the next stone, the next field, or the next quiet stretch of sand far from the water's edge. This scattered fleet forms a single, silent testimony to human ambition. Each stranded hull is a question asked of the landscape, and the landscape, in turn, provides the answer. The climate shifts, and a green savanna becomes a desert, leaving painted boats high on a canyon wall. A king demands a floating palace, and engineers drain an entire lake to obey, only for fire to claim their work centuries later. A city grows hungry for land, and so it consumes its own obsolete ships, turning vessels of exploration into the literal bedrock of avenues and skyscrapers. These are not random accidents of preservation. They are deliberate intersections where human intention collided with the immutable forces of geology, meteorology, and time. We look at a ship in a field, and we are not just seeing a lost boat. We are reading a climate report from a wetter age, a religious text carved in cedar, a city planner's blueprint written in ballast stone. The true cargo of these vessels was never just spices or timber or warriors. It was ideas, the idea that a pharaoh could sail the stars, the idea that a merchant in Cyprus could trade with a chieftain in Scandinavia. The idea that a community's entire relationship with the divine could be sunk into a bog as an offering. When we follow these ships inland, we are tracing the migration of concepts across continents, carried not in scrolls or speeches, but in the very shape of a hull. They become cultural seeds planted far from their point of origin, sometimes taking root and sometimes lying dormant for millennia until we dig them up. So the next time you walk through a city park or drive past a quiet farmland, pause for a moment. The ground beneath you is not passive, it is an archive. It holds the ghost of shorelines, the memory of rivers that have changed course, and the skeletal remains of journeys that ended not at sea, but here on what we now call solid ground. These 50 ships ask us to redraw the map in our minds, to see the continents not as separate, static entities, but as dynamic stages upon which the most profound human dramas were played out, with the ship as the central, enduring character in every act. That silent solar bark still waiting beneath the Giza sand is our final anchor, but the story never truly ends. So, which of these landlocked ships surprised you the most? Was it the Viking Brotherhood in the Estonian field, a family business that ended in a single, bloody afternoon? Or perhaps the Tudor world perfectly preserved in the Solent mud, where we can still hear the echoes of a king's pride sinking before his eyes. Every vessel we've explored is a conversation starter, a piece of evidence that challenges the simple map in our heads. Do you know of any other vessels found in bizarre places? Maybe a local legend from your own area, a story about a ship discovered far inland that never made the history books. The comments below are the perfect harbor for those tales. Share your thoughts, your local mysteries, or even which of these 50 journeys resonated with you. This exploration thrives on curiosity, and your perspective adds another layer to the map. If you enjoyed this voyage through history, tracing the ghostly wakes from desert to bog to city foundation, be sure to hit that like button. It lets us know which depths to plumb next. And subscribe for more deep dives into the world's greatest mysteries, where we piece together the puzzles of our past, one unexpected discovery at a time. Thank you for sailing with us through this fleet of forgotten giants. Until next time, keep exploring. The past is all around you, often buried in the most ordinary ground, waiting for a question to bring